The recordings exist not as rumor, not as the inference of people who were nearby and who absorbed the atmosphere of a marriage in crisis, without being given the specific evidence of what the crisis contained. As physical recordings, cassette tapes, made in secret in a private room in Kensington Palace, by a woman who understood that she was producing evidence and who understood why evidence was necessary. Diana spoke into those tapes across several sessions in late 1991 and into 1992. She spoke about her marriage, about her husband, about what the marriage had actually been, the private reality behind the managed surface of one of the most photographed and most discussed unions in the history of the modern monarchy. She spoke with the specific quality of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and who has finally found a form, private, controlled, manageable, in which to put it down without the consequences that putting it down in public would immediately produce. The form was Andrew Morton, the book that became Diana. Her true story was built from those recordings, the raw, unscripted direct testimony of a woman who was inside the marriage and who was, across the hours of the sessions, producing the most detailed first-person account of that marriage's private reality that anyone inside it would ever produce. The palace's response to the book's publication in June 1992 was the response of an institution that had been managing the information environment around the Wales marriage for a decade, and that found, in the book's appearance, the specific kind of disruption that no amount of proactive management can fully prepare for. The disruption of a source who has bypassed the management apparatus entirely, who has spoken directly, in their own voice, about things the apparatus had been working to keep out of the public sphere. The disruption was significant. The book produced the most significant single shift in public understanding of the Wales marriage that had occurred since the wedding. But the disruption was managed, contained in the specific institutional way that the palace contained, the specific dimensions of the disclosure that most threatened the official account, while allowing the surface of the marriage to be maintained for another 3 years before the formal separation was acknowledged. The management relied on a specific institutional resource, the doubt that the indirection of Morton's sourcing created. The book was attributed to sources close to Diana. Diana herself, at the time of the book's publication, neither confirmed nor denied her direct involvement. The palace's communications apparatus worked that gap, the gap between what the book's sourcing implied and what it explicitly confirmed, to produce the specific reading of the book as potentially unreliable, potentially exaggerated, potentially the account of someone whose mental health difficulties had been documented and whose reliability as a narrator of her own experience the palace had spent years positioning as questionable. The doubt held the management operation together for 3 years. Then Diana sat in front of Martin Bashir's camera on the 20th of November 1995 and the doubt dissolved. The gap between the implication and the confirmation closed in the specific public 23 million viewer way that produced the most significant public recalibration of the Wales marriage's reality since Diana had first walked into it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. But the recordings had always been there. The tapes Morton made from Diana's sessions were the foundation, the specific direct first-person documentation of a marriage whose public face was the managed surface that the institution had produced and whose private face was the documentation that Diana had spent months producing in the private room in Kensington Palace. The man at the centre of the documentation is now king. He is King Charles III, crowned in Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May 2023, in a ceremony that the world watched, and that the institution managed with the thoroughness of an organisation that has been producing these ceremonies for 1,000 years. He is the head of state of a country of 67 million people. He is the titular head of a commonwealth that extends across the globe. He is the figure whose face appears on the currency, and whose name is invoked in the legal proceedings of a nation. He is also the man Diana documented, the perfect public figure and the private reality that Diana spent years recording. In the Morton sessions, in the Bashir interview, in the letters and the conversations, and the specific testimony of the people trusted enough to tell. coexist in the public record in the way that managed surfaces and documented private realities always coexist when the documentation is as direct and as sourced and as specifically attributed as Diana's documentation was. The public received the coronation. The record contains the documentation. Both are true. This account is about the documentation, what it describes, how it was produced, what it cost the woman who produced it, what the institution did with it, and what it means that the man the documentation describes is now the man wearing the crown. Diana documented it. The documentation is in the record. The record does not disappear because the man it describes has been crowned. It waits. This account reads it. The public bought something very specific when it bought the Charles and Diana story. Not just the wedding, though the wedding was among the most significant single purchases the British public made in the 20th century in terms of the emotional investment it represented. The 250 million television viewers globally, the crowds along the processional route, the specific quality of collective feeling that a ceremony of that scale and that specific emotional charge produces in the people who receive it. The wedding was the moment of maximum purchase, the peak of the transaction's value as an exchange of institutional image for public trust. But the purchase was longer and more sustained than the wedding alone. It was the purchase of a story, a narrative about a man and a woman and what their union represented for the institution they were carrying forward. The narrative required specific elements to function. The man had to be worth the purchase. He had to be the reformed heir, the prince who had learned from the failures of the generation before him, the future king who understood that the monarchy's claim on the public's loyalty was not automatic but earned, and that earning it required being something different from what the previous generation's monarchy had been. The narrative was built around Charles' specific public qualities, the qualities the image apparatus had identified as most valuable in the construction of reformed heir's profile and had cultivated in the public account of who Charles was with the sustained attention of professional image management, working toward a specific institutional objective. The intellectual seriousness was among the most cultivated of these qualities. Charles as the thinking prince, the man who read widely, who engaged with environmental issues before they were fashionable, who gave speeches about architecture and organic farming and the spiritual dimensions of public life that positioned him as someone whose engagement with the world went beyond the ceremonial functions of the hereditary role. The speeches were real. Charles did think about these things, did hold these views, did engage with the subjects of his speeches in ways that were more substantive than the performative engagement of a man reading from a brief someone else had written. The intellectual seriousness was genuine. The cultivation of the genuine quality was the image apparatus's specific skill. A genuine quality, when it is cultivated and managed and presented through the mechanisms of institutional image management, becomes something more than the genuine quality itself. It becomes the central pillar of a public image that is built around the quality in ways that communicate it as the defining feature of the man rather than as one element of a more complex character. The cultivation took Charles's genuine intellectual engagement with certain subjects and produced from it the image of a thoughtful, serious, reformed future king whose engagement with the world was defined by the intellectual qualities the cultivation had made most prominent. The sensitivity was similarly cultivated. Charles as the sensitive prince, the man whose public persona communicated a quality of feeling that the royal family's traditional emotional register, the reserved and controlled presentation of the institution's requirement for composure, had not previously permitted. The speeches about loneliness and inner life and the specific of emotional acknowledgement that Charles brought to certain public contexts were in the sense that they reflected genuine aspects of his private engagement with his own emotional life. The cultivation of this reality into the public image of a sensitive prince was the image apparatus's second major construction. The reforms were the third. Charles as the reforming heir, the man whose public program communicated a commitment to making the monarchy more relevant, more engaged, more connected to the realities of contemporary British life than the institution's previous expressions had managed. The charities, the Prince's Trust in particular, which became the most significant institutional expression of the reformed heir's image, the specific, practical, publicly visible investment in young people and disadvantaged communities that gave the public something concrete to assess the narrative's validity against. The prince's trust was genuine. The work it did, and the lives it changed, and the specific institutional legacy it represents are real, and are not this account subject to diminish. The work was good work, and the commitment behind it was real, and the specific accomplishment of having built a significant charitable institution from the position of a future king who was not yet king is a genuine achievement that the public's assessment of the man's public career was entitled to weight. The purchase the public made included all of this: the intellectual seriousness, the sensitivity, the reformed heir's genuine achievements in the public sphere. The purchase was not baseless. It was not the pure construction of an image apparatus selling a fiction to a credulous public. It was the purchase of a managed version of a real person, a version that selected and cultivated specific genuine qualities and presented them as the complete account of who the man was. The management's specific technique was not fabrication. It was selection and omission, the presentation of the selected genuine qualities as the defining features of the man and the omission of the dimensions of the private character that the managed surface was constructed to conceal. The public bought the selected genuine qualities and received them as the complete account, because the management apparatus ensured that the omitted dimensions were not available to complicate the purchase. The omitted dimensions are the subject of this account. They are the dimensions that Diana documented, not as an act of hostile opposition to the man she had married, though the relationship had reached the point where the hostility was not an unreasonable response to what the relationship contained, as the specific act of a woman who understood that she was inside a management operation that had the full resources of the institution behind it, and that her own experience of what the management was concealing was the only evidence available to her. The evidence was her testimony. The testimony was the documentation. The documentation is what survived the management operation's sustained effort to prevent it from achieving the public visibility that would have made the purchase's incompleteness apparent to the 23 million people who had watched the wedding and who had invested in the narrative it initiated. The public bought the perfect prince. The documentation described something different. The description is what this account follows. The perfect prince is in the mainstream record, in the coronation and the prince's trust and the decades of public service and the managed cultivation of the intellectual seriousness and the sensitivity and the reformed heir's genuine accomplishments. The documentation is in the record too. Both are true. The purchase was real. The documentation was real. The distance between what was purchased and what was documented is the distance this account is about. The first thing Diana noticed was not a specific incident, it was a quality, a specific quality of the private register. The register in which Charles communicated in the private spaces of the household when the public register was not required, when the cameras were not present, and the public performance was not being produced, and the man was simply himself in the domestic environment that the marriage created around him. The private register was different from the public one, sufficiently different that the difference was itself information. Information about the distance between the person who communicated in the public register with the specific qualities the image apparatus had cultivated and the person who communicated in the private register with the qualities the public register's absence allowed to emerge. The public register was warm in the managed way of institutional warmth, the specific quality of public engagement that the image apparatus had produced from Charles's genuine interest in certain subjects and certain contexts and had cultivated into the consistent presentation of a man who was present and interested and engaged in his public interactions. The warmth was real in those interactions. The people who received it directly, in the engagements and the visits, and the specific public contexts where Charles's genuine intellectual engagement with the subjects he cared about was most available, received something genuine alongside the managed presentation. The private register had a different temperature, not the opposite of warm, not the specific coldness that would have constituted the clearest possible evidence of the distance between the public and private person. Something more complicated than that. something that shifted with circumstances in ways that Diana, across the early months of the marriage, began to map with the specific attention of someone who is trying to understand the environment they have entered. The mapping is the beginning of the documentation in its earliest and least formal form. Diana's documentation of Charles did not begin with the Morton sessions. It began in the early months of the marriage, in the specific cognitive process of a young woman who had entered a new environment with certain expectations formed from the public register's presentation, and who was discovering, through the daily accumulation of experience in the private register's expression, that the expectations required revision. The expectations had been formed from the public register, the intellectual seriousness, the man who engaged with ideas and with the world, and with the specific subjects he cared about in ways that the public profile had made the defining feature of his persona. The sensitivity, the man whose emotional register was more available than the royal family's traditional composure suggested, was possible in someone formed by that tradition. The reform, the man whose public program communicated the specific commitment to doing things differently from how they had been done by the generation before him. Diana had entered the marriage with these expectations. She had entered it, also, as someone who was 20 years old at the time of the wedding. 20 years old, and in love in the specific way that 20-year-old people are in love, with the specific completeness and specific vulnerability of someone whose understanding of love has been formed more by imagination and hope than by the accumulated experience of sustained adult relationships. The love was real. This account does not contest it. The specific feelings Diana brought to the beginning of the marriage were genuine. The specific quality of emotional investment that her subsequent accounts of the early period describe as the foundation from which the later disillusionment was built. You can only be disillusioned about something you genuinely believed. The disillusionment that Diana's documentation describes was built on the foundation of genuine belief in what the public register had communicated and genuine love for the man the public register had appeared to be. The private register began to complicate both. The first complication was temporal. Charles's engagement with Diana in the private register was intermittent in a way that the public register did not prepare her for. The man who communicated in the public register with the consistent presence and interest of someone engaged with the world he was moving through communicated in the private register with a quality of presence that was more variable, more dependent on the specific circumstances of the moment, more susceptible to the withdrawal that Diana began to notice as the characteristic expression of a private temperament that the public register's consistency did not reflect. The withdrawal was not dramatic. It was not the explicit cold shoulder or the stated preference for solitude that would have constituted a clear communication about the private temperament's requirements. It was the specific quality of someone who was in the room but not fully present to the room, whose attention was located somewhere else, whose engagement with the immediate domestic environment was perfunctory rather than genuine, whose communication in the private register had the quality of a man managing an obligation rather than inhabiting a relationship. Diana noticed this. She noticed it in the mornings, when the quality of Charles's engagement with the beginning of a shared day had a specific perfunctory character that the public register's warmth had not prepared her for. She noticed it in the evenings, when the day's public program had concluded and the private domestic space should have been the context for the genuine engagement that the public register suggested was available. The evenings were particularly significant. The evenings were when Camilla called, not immediately visible as Camilla. Diana's understanding of the call's specific provenance developed across the early months of the marriage in the gradual way that knowledge of a sustained deception develops in someone who is living inside it. But the calls were present from early in the marriage, and the quality of Charles's engagement before and during and after the calls was part of the private register that Diana was mapping. The mapping produced the first understanding of the private register's specific character. Charles communicated very differently depending on who he was communicating with and in what context. With the people whose presence animated him. The calls, the specific social contexts of the world he had moved through before the marriage, and that the marriage did not eliminate from his private life. The private register had a warmth and a vitality that corresponded more closely to the public register's presentation. With Diana in the domestic private space of the marriage itself, the private register had the more variable, more intermittent, more perfunctory quality that she was discovering as the working condition of the private marriage. The second complication was tonal. The tone of the private register, when Charles was communicating with Diana directly rather than managing the domestic obligations' perfunctory expressions, had a specific quality that the public register had not prepared her for. The tone was not always the tone that the relationship's beginning stages had established. The occasional tenderness, the specific moments of genuine engagement between two people who were discovering each other. The quality that the early period of any relationship has when the connection is being built from the beginning. The tone shifted, not uniformly, not irreversibly in any single moment, but with a consistency across the accumulation of the early months, that the tone-specific character was becoming established as the private register's characteristic expression, rather than as the occasional aberration from the tenderness the beginning had contained. The characteristic expression included the specific quality that Diana's subsequent documentation would describe in the specific terms that direct experience in the private register over sustained time produces. The dismissive, the condescending, the specific register of someone communicating with a person they consider less than their intellectual or social equal, and who they do not take particular care to conceal this assessment from in the private space of the domestic environment. The public register communicated the sensitivity, the emotional availability, the quality of engagement that the image apparatus had cultivated from Charles's genuine capacities in certain contexts. The private register communicated something that the public register's sensitivity narrative could not accommodate, the specific quality of a man whose sensitivity was contextually available rather than generally present, who brought it to the subjects and the contexts that activated it, and withdrew it from the subjects and the contexts that did not. Diana did not activate Charles's sensitivity in the way that the public register suggested he brought it to his engagements. She activated, in the private domestic register, a different response. A response whose specific character was inconsistent with the sensitivity narrative in ways that the public register's presentation could not have prepared her for, and that the early months of the marriage were beginning to establish as the characteristic private reality of the man she had married. The third complication was the specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana's own experience. The sensitivity that the public register communicated was available, in principle, to the experiences and the needs and the specific difficulties of the people Charles engaged with in his public role, the young people of the Prince's Trust, the communities he visited, the individuals he met in the public context where the image apparatus had positioned the sensitivity narrative most prominently. In the private register, in the domestic space of the marriage, the sensitivity's availability to Diana's own experience was limited in ways that she began to document from early in the marriage. Limited not in the single dramatic confrontation that would constitute a specific event, but in the daily quality of a private relationship in which one person's experience and its expression was received by the other, with the specific quality of not receiving that is more damaging than explicit dismissal, because it does not constitute a named event that can be addressed. It simply is the background condition of a private relationship in which one person's interior life is not received as significant by the person they are closest to. The background condition was the first thing Diana noticed. She noticed it, and she filed it, and she continued, because the early marriage and the hope and the love were still present alongside the mapping, and the filing was not yet the conscious documentation of a woman who understood that she was producing evidence. It would become that. The becoming was not sudden. It was the accumulation of the private register's expression across the months and years of the marriage. The accumulation of a pattern that the mapping eventually produced a picture of that was clear enough to require documentation rather than simply filing. The picture was the private Charles. The documentation was Diana's response to the picture. The picture and the documentation are what this account follows. The first thing Diana noticed was a quality. The quality was the beginning. The decision to document is not a decision that happens in a single moment. It develops through the accumulation of experiences that each individually might absorbed or set aside or processed through the ordinary mechanisms of adjustment that people apply to the difficulties of significant relationships, and that together eventually reach a threshold at which the absorbing and the setting aside and the processing are no longer sufficient responses to what is being accumulated. The threshold is the point at which the person inside the accumulation understands, with the clarity that thresholds produce, that what is happening requires a different response, a response that is not the passive absorption of the ongoing experience, but the active creation of a record of it. Diana reached that threshold. The reaching was not a dramatic decision made in response to a single dramatic event. It was the conclusion of the mapping process this account's part 2 described. The completion of the picture that the private register's accumulation had been producing across the months and years of the early marriage, at the point where the picture was sufficiently complete to require something more than the private filing of each element as it was added. The something more was documentation, the specific, deliberate, considered act of creating a record, of taking what existed in the private sphere of her own experience and placing it in a form that had the potential to outlast the private sphere, to exist independently of her memory and her continued willingness to carry it, to be available to whoever needed to understand what the private reality of the marriage had been. Understanding why Diana started keeping records requires understanding the specific conditions that made the documentation necessary from her perspective, the specific character of her situation at the point when the documentation began, the specific resources available to her, and the specific assessment she had reached about what the documentation was for and what it needed to accomplish. The first condition that made documentation necessary was the institution. The institution, the palace, the management apparatus, the communications operation, and the legal structure, and the social code that together constituted the management of the public account of the Wales marriage, had been operating continuously from the beginning of the marriage to produce and maintain the official version. The official version placed Charles at the centre of the narrative as the reformed heir, the sensitive prince, the man whose qualities the image apparatus had cultivated into the public account that the public had received and invested in. Diana was inside that narrative as the supporting figure, the princess whose role was to be the appropriate partner to the narrative's central figure, to provide the specific visual and social presence that the image required, and to manage her own private experience of the marriage in the manner that the institutional requirement of surface maintenance demanded. The institution's management of the narrative did not include any mechanism for Diana's private experience to be acknowledged or addressed. The management was not designed for that purpose and was not deployed in its service. The absence of any institutional mechanism for the acknowledgement of her private experience was itself a condition that the documentation was a response to. A woman inside a significant institution whose private experience of that institution's most central relationship is specifically managed out of the official account has two available responses. The first is the absorption, the management of the private experience in the private sphere, the maintenance of the official account, the daily performance of the surface that the institution requires. Diana had been doing this for the early years of the marriage, with the accumulating cost that this series has described in preceding accounts of comparable situations. The second response is the documentation, the creation of a record that exists independently of the institution's management of the official account, that carries the private experience out of the private sphere in a form that has the potential to make it available to people who are not inside the institution's management operation and who receive the private experience not as disruption of the official account, but as information about what the official account has been constructed to conceal. Diana chose the second response, not at the expense of the first. She continued the surface maintenance alongside the documentation, because the surface maintenance was the condition of remaining inside the situation in the specific way that remaining inside it was the condition of the documentation's eventual effectiveness. The documentation required the continuation of the surface maintenance, because a documentation project that produced its evidence from a position outside the institution would have had the specific vulnerability of the account that the institution's management apparatus can position as external and hostile. The documentation from inside the institution, from the person who was continuing to perform the service while producing the record, had the specific authority of insider testimony that the institution's external positioning cannot easily reduce. The calculation was Diana's own, not articulated in these terms, not the explicit strategic assessment that hindsight makes available, but present in the specific decisions about how to proceed and what to do with what she was documenting, and when and through which channels, as the operating logic of someone who understood more about the situation she was in and the institution she was inside than the institution had accounted for when it selected her as the appropriate partner for the narrative's central figure. The second condition that made documentation necessary was the isolation. The specific isolation this series has described in preceding accounts. The absence of anyone inside Diana's immediate environment whose loyalty was to her rather than to the institution, the absence of the trusted witnesses and the accountable relationships that civilian life provides as the natural context for the processing of significant private experiences, the specific management of her social environment by the institutional apparatus that replaced the natural civilian support structures with the institutional structures whose loyalty was to the institution rather than to Diana. The isolation meant that the documentation could not take the form of the natural first-person narrative that most people produce when they need to process a significant private experience, the conversation with a trusted friend, the journal that is never intended for any eyes but the writer's own, the gradual externalization of the private experience through the ordinary social mechanisms of shared human life. The isolation had made those mechanisms unavailable or unreliable. Unreliable in the specific sense that anyone Diana confided in within the institutional context was a potential source for the management apparatus, a potential conduit for information flowing back to the people whose management of the official account required the private experience to stay in the private sphere. The Morton sessions were the solution to the isolation-specific problem. Andrew Morton was outside the institutional context, not a journalist who depended on palace access for his professional standing, not a courtier whose career was contingent on the institution's approval, not a member of the social world whose belonging depended on the code's observance. He was a journalist with a specific project and a specific commitment to Diana's account, that the specific arrangements of the sessions, the cassette tapes, the private recordings, the removal of Morton himself from the immediate process of Diana's speaking, allowed Diana to engage with, without the institutional exposure that a more conventional journalistic relationship would have created. The arrangement was designed by Diana, the specific form of the sessions. Diana alone, in a room with the questions Morton had prepared, speaking to the recorder rather than to the journalist directly, producing the testimony in the private form before it became the public form of the published book, was Diana's specific solution to the specific problem of producing documentation in conditions of institutional surveillance. She controlled what she said. She controlled the session's form. She controlled, up to the point of Morton's eventual publication decisions, the specific content of the record she was producing. The control was the third condition that made the Morton form of documentation the one Diana chose. The documentation required control, the specific control of someone who understood that the record she was producing would eventually need to stand against the institution's management apparatus, and that the management apparatus would deploy every available tool to discredit the record if the record was not produced in a form whose credibility was sufficiently robust to resist the discrediting. The credibility of the record depended on its form. Diana's direct voice, the unscripted, first-person, specific and detailed testimony of a woman who was inside the marriage and who was speaking directly about what the marriage contained, was the most credible form available, because it was the form that the management apparatus was least equipped to reduce. The management apparatus could discredit a second-hand account. It could question the reliability of an account that depended on the journalist's interpretation of the source's testimony. It could position an account as the exaggeration or the distortion of a source whose mental health difficulties had been documented and whose reliability the apparatus had spent years managing. What the apparatus could not as easily discredit was the voice itself, the specific, direct, unmediated voice of the person whose experience the documentation described, speaking about that experience in the specific terms that direct experience produces, and that the apparatus had no equivalent voice to counter. The cassette tapes were the form that preserved the voice, the specific, direct, Diana's own words quality that the Morton book would eventually be built from, in the form that the institution most needed to prevent from reaching the public and that Diana had most carefully designed to ensure would reach the public regardless of what the institution did to prevent it. The documentation was also the response to a specific understanding that Diana had reached about the institution's long-term strategy. The long-term strategy, as Diana had observed it, operating across the years of the marriage, was the management of her private experience into the specific form of the mentally unstable, unreliable narrator, the positioning of her genuine difficulties, her genuine health crises, her genuine responses to the impossible situation the marriage had placed her in, as the evidence of a private instability whose effect on her reliability as a witness to her own experience made everything she said about the marriage's private reality suspect. The positioning was the institution's preemptive discrediting strategy. If Diana ever spoke, the institution would deploy the positioning, would say that the woman who was speaking had documented mental health difficulties, that her experience of the marriage was distorted by those difficulties, that the account she was providing was the account of someone whose grip on the shared reality of the marriage was weakened by the instabilities the institution had been documenting. Across the years of its management of her private health, Diana understood this strategy. She understood it clearly enough to design the documentation as a counter to it, to produce a record whose specific character was the character of someone speaking clearly, coherently, in specific detail about specific experiences in a way that the instability narrative could not easily accommodate. The recordings are not the recordings of someone in the grip of the distorted perception that the instability narrative required. They are the recordings of someone in full possession of their faculties, speaking with the specific precision of someone who has thought carefully about what they want to say, and who is saying it in the most accurate available terms. The precision is itself the counter to the discrediting strategy. The discrediting requires a target that can be dismissed as the product of distorted perception. The precision resists dismissal. Not completely, not in the eyes of people who were committed to the dismissal, regardless of the evidence, but sufficiently for the record to achieve the credibility that Diana needed it to achieve when it eventually reached the public. Diana started keeping records because she understood that the institution was managing the official account against her private experience, that the isolation had removed the natural mechanisms for processing and sharing the private experience, that the control of her own documentation was the specific response to the specific form of the vulnerability the institution's management had created, and that the long-term strategy the institution was preparing against her required a counter whose form she needed to design carefully and execute precisely. She designed it carefully, she executed it precisely. The documentation exists. The sessions happened in a room in Kensington Palace in late 1991 and into the early months of 1992. Diana was alone in the room with the recorder, and the questions Andrew Morton had prepared on index cards and passed to her through an intermediary, James Colthurst, a mutual friend who served as the specific buffer between Diana and Morton that the arrangement required to maintain Diana's debility if the project's existence was discovered before she chose to acknowledge it. The buffer was the design's most important feature. Diana, speaking directly to Morton, would have constituted a conventional journalistic source relationship whose existence, if discovered, the palace's legal apparatus could manage through the standard mechanisms of legal threat and access withdrawal. Diana speaking alone to a recorder in her own room, with the questions passed through a buffer, was a form of documentation whose management was considerably more difficult because the direct relationship that the legal threat required to be directed at was not present. She spoke into the recorder in the specific way that someone speaks when they are alone, without the audience management that the presence of another person produces, without the specific modulation of the account that the awareness of being observed always introduces into human communication. The recordings have a quality that the people who have worked from them, Morton himself, and subsequently the researchers and journalists who have had access to the transcripts and to the recordings themselves, consistently describe as the quality of unmediated testimony. The specific, direct, present quality of someone saying what happened in the terms that the experience of what happened produced, without the intermediary of an editorial process or a narrative construction that organizes the experience into a form designed for an audience. The unmediated quality is the recording's most significant feature as documentation, and it was the quality that Diana was most deliberately producing through the specific form of the sessions. The management apparatus's discrediting strategy required a target that could be positioned as shaped by the distorting effects of Diana's documented difficulties, as the account of someone whose grip on reality was uncertain and whose testimony was therefore unreliable in ways that the observer who was not inside the situation could not easily evaluate. The unmediated testimony is the counter to this positioning, because the unmediated quality is the quality of someone who is in full contact with their own experience, speaking about it directly, in the specific terms that direct experience produces when the person inside the experience is cognitively and emotionally present to it. Diana was cognitively and emotionally present to what she said in the sessions. The recordings are not the testimony of someone in crisis, speaking from inside the specific distortion of acute suffering. They are the testimony of someone who has achieved sufficient distance from the specific experiences she is describing to speak about them with the specific clarity that distance and reflection produce, who is still inside the marriage, still inside the situation, but who has developed the perspective that the sustained documentation of her own experience had given her across the years of the mapping and the filing and the gradual organization of the private reality into the form the documentation required. What she said in the sessions covered the full range of what the documentation was designed to contain. The specific experiences of the marriage private reality, the experiences this account has been approaching through the preceding part's establishment of the context and the character, and the conditions of the documentation's production, were the primary content of the sessions. The content was specific, detailed, and in the specific terms of direct personal experience rather than the general terms of an account produced for an audience. The specific detail is the recording's most important evidential quality. The management apparatus's discrediting strategy relies on the general account, on the claim that the source's account is too general, too unspecific, too clearly shaped by the emotional requirements of someone who wants to present themselves in a specific light to constitute reliable testimony. The specific detail resists this claim. The specific detail of Diana's account, the specific incidents, the specific words, the specific quality of the private experiences, described in the terms that someone inside those experiences produces, rather than someone observing them from outside, is the quality that the management apparatus is least equipped to position as unreliable, without itself engaging with the specific detail and producing specific counter-evidence. The Palace did not produce specific counter-evidence when the Morton book was published in June 1992. The response was the general response that the management apparatus applies to all threatening disclosures. The general positioning of the source as unreliable, the general suggestion that the account was one-sided, the general management of the information environment around the book's reception to ensure that the sympathetic coverage positioned the account as disputed rather than as established. The general response was the most that the management apparatus could produce in the face of the specific detail, because specific counter-evidence would have required engagement with the private reality that the management entire operation was designed
to prevent from reaching the public in the first place.
What did Diana say in the sessions? The sessions' content, as it was eventually made public through the Morton book and subsequently through the transcripts and recordings that Morton published after Diana's death, describes several specific dimensions of the marriage private reality that the preceding parts of this account have been approaching through the context and conditions of the documentation's production. The first dimension was the emotional isolation. Diana described in the sessions the specific quality of her emotional isolation inside the marriage, the absence of the reciprocal engagement that a genuine partnership provides, the specific experience of being emotionally alone in a relationship whose official account positioned it as a partnership. The isolation was not the abstract loneliness of someone whose circumstances had removed them from their social world, though the specific social isolation that the institutional environment produced was part of what Diana described. It was the more specific and more damaging isolation of someone whose primary relationship, the relationship that should have been the primary context for the processing and sharing of their inner life, was not available to them as that context. The second dimension was the specific character of Charles's private communication. Diana described in these sessions the quality of Charles's private register that this account's part 2 has been building toward, the dismissive, the condescending, the specific tonal register of someone communicating with a person they consider less than their intellectual or social equal. The descriptions were specific incidents, specific exchanges, specific occasions, when the private register's character expressed itself in ways that Diana had filed and retained with the precision of someone who understood that the specific detail was the documentation's most important quality. The condescension was the dimension of the private register that the sessions describe most consistently and most specifically, not the dramatic confrontation or the explosive anger that would have constituted the most obviously reportable form of mistreatment. The quieter, more pervasive, more insidiously damaging condescension of someone who communicates their assessment of another person's inadequacy through the specific quality of their daily engagement with that person, rather than through any single dramatic statement of the assessment. The condescension expressed itself in specific ways that Diana's sessions document with the specific detail that makes the documentation evidentially significant. The dismissal of her observations about the world, the specific quality of receiving Diana's engagement with subject she cared about in the deflective manner of someone who considers the engagement not worth genuine response, the correction of her expressions, the specific quality of someone who consistently managed Diana's communication in the private register with the quality of a person correcting an inferior's mistakes rather than engaging with a partner's perspective. The specific register of the evening conversations, when Charles's engagement with Diana in the private domestic space of the marriage had the quality of someone managing an obligation rather than inhabiting a relationship. The third dimension was the specific brutality of certain exchanges. Brutality is the word this account's title uses, and it requires examination in the specific context of what Diana's documentation describes. Because brutality in this context is not the brutality of physical harm, the documentation does not describe physical harm. It is the brutality of the specific, targeted, deliberate communication to another person of their inadequacy in terms designed to cause maximum damage to their sense of themselves and their confidence in their own perception of reality. The specific exchanges Diana described in the sessions had this quality. Exchanges in which Charles communicated to Diana in the private register, the public register's management requirements were absent. A specific assessment of who she was and what she was worth that was designed, not unconsciously, not as the incidental product of someone whose emotional management was inadequate, but deliberately, to produce in her the specific diminishment of self-perception that the exchanges in fact produced. The deliberateness is the dimension that makes the documentation most significant in the assessment of the man the documentation describes. The unintentional communication of contempt, the person who does not realize they are communicating their assessment of another person's inadequacy, because the assessment is too naturalized to be visible to them, is damaging but does not carry the same moral weight as the deliberate communication of contempt, the specific targeting of another person's vulnerabilities with the intent to diminish rather than the intent to engage. Diana's documentation describes the deliberate version. The specific quality of exchanges in which she was inside the marriage price and Charles's communication had the character of someone who knew where the vulnerabilities were and who was choosing to direct the communication at those vulnerabilities in ways that produced the specific damage the direction was designed to produce. The sessions cost Diana what the production of documentation always costs: the specific psychological cost of retrieving and articulating the specific experiences that the documentation required, in the full clarity of the present tense of the sessions, rather than the managed distance of memory that time provides to experiences that have been placed in the past. The retrieving was necessary for the documentation to have the specific quality Diana needed it to have, the unmediated, present, specific detailed quality that made it resistant to the management apparatus's discrediting strategy. But the retrieving was also the cost, the re-inhabiting of the experiences in the form that the clear articulation required. The sessions cost Diana something additional that the documentation itself could not fully protect her from: the exposure of the documentation's existence to the risk of discovery. The palace's surveillance of Diana's communications was real. Part 3 of this account has described her awareness of it as one of the conditions that shaped the form of the documentation. The sessions were conducted with the specific precautions the design required. But the precautions were not absolute protection. The risk was present from the beginning. The risk materialized in the period between the sessions and the book's publication,
when the palace's communications apparatus
became aware that something was being prepared and began the specific preemptive management that the disclosure's potential threat to the official account required. The management was partially effective. It produced the conditions under which Diana's direct involvement in the book was deniable, which protected Diana from the most immediate consequences of the disclosure's full acknowledgement. But the management did not prevent the disclosure, and the disclosure produced the specific institutional response that the management apparatus deploys against the most threatening possible account. The comprehensive effort to position the source as unreliable and the documentation as the product of distorted perception. Diana's voice survived the positioning. The recordings, the specific, direct, unmediated quality of the cassette tapes that Morton eventually published after Diana's death, are the evidence of the survival. The management apparatus's positioning required a target that could be dismissed. The voice of the recordings is not dismissible in the specific terms the positioning required, because the voice has the quality of someone who is present and clear and specific in the ways that genuine testimony is present and clear and specific. The sessions were Diana's most significant act of documentation. They were not her last. The Bashir interview was coming, but the sessions were the foundation, the first systematic, deliberate, carefully designed act of a woman who had decided that the private reality of her marriage required a record, and who had produced that record in the form that the specific conditions of her situation made possible, and that the specific purpose the record was designed to serve required. The documentation had begun, the record existed, the management apparatus could position it but could not prevent it. It was in the world. The word brutal requires the same examination here that the word merciless required in the Anne account and the word nasty required in the Camilla and William accounts. Each of these words is chosen by a person who has been inside the proximity and who has selected the word that most accurately describes what the proximity showed them. Each word carries the weight of the selection, the weight of someone who has processed the experience and reduced it to its most accurate form before naming it. The naming is the documentation's most significant act, because the naming transforms the private experience from the shapeless accumulation of lived difficulty into the specific, accessible, communicable fact of a description that other people can receive and evaluate. Brutal describes something that the gentler vocabulary of the Public Register's account of Charles does not permit. The Public Register's account had the vocabulary of a complex man, intellectually serious but emotionally complicated, sensitive in certain contexts but difficult in others, a man whose private life had its difficulties but whose public achievements and genuine commitment to his causes were the defining features of his public identity. The complex man vocabulary is the vocabulary of the management apparatus' most sophisticated operation. the acknowledgement of a certain level of difficulty, sufficient to prevent the complete denial of what the private knowledge contained, while ensuring that the acknowledgement remains within the range of the ordinary human complexity that does not require the public vow to reassess its purchase of the public register's account. Brutal is outside that range. Brutal does not describe ordinary human complexity. It describes the specific quality of behavior whose distinguishing characteristic is the deliberate, directed infliction of damage on the person on the receiving end of the behavior. Damage that the person doing the inflicting understands they are inflicting and that the infliction is designed to produce. Diana's documentation describes this quality, not in the explicit terms that would constitute a formal accusation. The documentation is not a legal document, and the evidential standards it is held to are the evidential standards of first-person testimony rather than the evidential standards of a legal proceeding. But in the specific terms of direct personal experience, the documentation describes encounters whose quality has the character of deliberate directed damage rather than the character of the ordinary relational difficulty that the complex man vocabulary accommodates. The specific brutalities the documentation describes fall into several distinct categories that the available record allows identification of. The first category is what might be called intellectual brutality. The specific targeted communication of Diana's intellectual inadequacy in the private register, deployed in the context where the assessment would cause the most damage, the context of Diana's own genuine interest or engagement, where the dismissal of the engagement as inadequate was most costly because it was most specifically aimed at the dimension of Diana's self-expression that she was most invested in. Diana was not unintelligent. The people who knew her, who worked with her, who engaged with her on subjects she cared about, consistently described someone whose intelligence was real and whose specific kind of intelligence, the emotional, relational, socially attuned intelligence that the public's experience of Diana confirmed, was genuine and considerable. The management apparatus had spent years managing this intelligence out of the official account, because the official account required Diana to occupy the supporting figure position in the narrative rather than the position of a genuine intellectual presence whose engagement with the world was comparable to Charles's own. The managing of Diana's intelligence out of the official account served the specific purpose of confirming Charles as the intellectual presence in the marriage. The reformed heir's narrative required his intellectual seriousness to be the defining feature of the union, which required Diana's intellectual contribution to be subordinate to his. The management was institutional. The public contends was shaped by the institutional requirement rather than by the actual distribution of intellectual quality between the two people inside it. In the private register, the managing of Diana's intelligence out of the account took a different form, where the institutional management of the public account simply omitted Diana's intellectual contribution. The private register's management was more active, more directly engaged with the specific communication of Diana's intellectual inadequacy as an assessment rather than as an omission. The exchanges Diana described in the sections had the specific quality of someone who was making a point of communicating the inadequacy, who was not simply failing to acknowledge Diana's intelligence, but was actively communicating its absence in terms designed to be received as the assessment. Rather than engagement was not directed at Diana's intelligence. The directedness is the distinction between ordinary dismissiveness and the specific quality the word describes. Dismissiveness is the failure to engage with someone's contribution to a conversation or a relationship. The quality of not receiving what the other person is offering, whether through distraction or through genuine indifference to the contribution. The specific quality Diana's documentation describes was directed, was aimed at the specific dimension of Diana's self-presentation that she was most invested in, with the specific quality of communication designed to produce in her the assessment of her own inadequacy that Charles was directing at her. The second category is the emotional brutality, the specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana emotional experience in the private register, in the context where the emotional experience was expressed, and where the engagement had the quality of not just failing to provide the response, that genuine partnership would have provided, but of providing the specific opposite of that response. The specific opposite is the active diminishment of the emotional experience, the communication, in response to Diana's expression of her emotional reality. That the emotional reality is not a valid report of a real experience, but the product of the distorted perception that the management apparatus positioning was simultaneously preparing as the discrediting strategy's available weapon. The communication of this, in the private register, the specific response to Diana's emotional expression that told her that what she was feeling was not what was happening, is the specific form of the emotional brutality that the documentation describes and that the preceding accounts in this series have identified in comparable terms in comparable situations. The gaslighting dimension, the specific management of Diana's perception of her own experience in ways designed to make her doubt the reliability of that perception, is the most damaging form of the emotional brutality because it does not target the experience itself but the experiencer's ability to trust their own experience. The targeting produces the specific damage of making the person inside the experience doubt whether what they are experiencing is real, whether the accumulation of the private register's specific qualities they have been mapping is the reliable record of what has been happening, or the product of the distortion the other party is communicating as the explanation for their perception. Diana's documentation of the gaslighting dimension is among the most significant of the documentation's specific contributions to the record. The documentation is itself the counter to the gaslighting. The production of a record by whom has been told their perception is reliable is the specific act of insisting on the reliability of the perception against the communication that it is not reliable. The record's existence is the argument that the perception was trustworthy, that what Diana was experiencing was what she said she was experiencing, and that the documentation of it in the specific, detailed, unmediated form of the sessions was the evidence of its reality. The third category is the social brutality. The specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana in the social contexts that the marriage produced, where the public register's requirements were partially relaxed, but the full privacy of the domestic register was not present, and where the specific communication of Diana's inadequacy was most available to the people in the social environment who were present for the communication. The social contexts, the aristocratic gatherings, the country house weekends, the events of the social world that both parties inhabited, were the contexts where the private register's qualities were most visible to the people around the marriage. The specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana in these contexts, the dismissal, the condescension, the specific management of Diana's contribution to the social interactions in ways that communicated the assessment of her inadequacy to the people present, is documented by people who were in those contexts and whose accounts constitute the external confirmation of what the documentation describes from the inside. The external confirmation is significant as corroboration. The documentation is Diana's direct testimony, the first-person account of someone inside the experience. The external confirmation is the account of people who observed the same experiences from outside, who witnessed the specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana in the social contexts, and who formed, from their witnessing, the assessment that the documentation's internal account describes from inside. The corroboration is not uniformly available in the public record. The social code of the aristocratic world that produced the corroborating witnesses operates with the specific effectiveness that this series has described across multiple accounts to manage the corroborating witnesses' potential accounts into the silence of the private sphere. But the semi-public record contains enough of the corroboration in the oblique, carefully hedged accounts of people who were present in the relevant social contexts and who have described what they observed in the specific language of the social world's management of sensitive information, to establish the consistency between the internal documentation and the external observation. The fourth category is the strategic brutality, the specific, calculated use of Camilla as an instrument of psychological pressure on Diana in the private register. This dimension of the documentation is distinct from the simple fact of the parallel relationship, the fact of Camilla's ongoing primacy in Charles's emotional life, and the cost that this imposed on Diana. which has been described in preceding accounts in this series. The strategic brutality is the specific deployment of the parallel relationship as a weapon in the private register's dynamics. The specific communication of Camilla's presence and primacy in ways designed to maximize the psychological damage rather than simply the inevitable consequence of the situation's facts. The communication was not always explicit. It did not require the explicit statement of Camilla's presence and primacy to function as the communication of that presence and primacy. It operated through the specific qualities of behavior that communicated the assessment. The withdrawal of engagement after calls that Diana understood were from Camilla, the specific quality of comparison that operated in the private register's communication of Diana's inadequacy, the specific occasions when the communication of the parallel relationship's primacy was the deliberate direction of the private register at the specific psychological dimension where the damage would be most acute. Diana documented all four categories. The documentation is not a comprehensive transcript of every exchange and every experience in the marriage's private reality. It is the documentation of a person who was producing a record rather than an archive, who was making decisions about what the record required to contain and what the record's purpose required to emphasize. The decisions were made with the awareness that the documentation needed to achieve a specific purpose. The purpose of making the private reality available to the public in a form that the management apparatus's discrediting strategy could not reduce to the product of distorted perception. The documentation achieved this purpose. Not completely. The management apparatus's deployment of the complex man vocabulary and the discrediting strategy's positioning of Diana's reliability had sufficient reach to maintain the doubt among people who were committed to the doubt, but sufficiently for the public that received the documentation through the Morton book and through the Bashir interview to have access to the specific, detailed first-person account of the private reality that the management apparatus had been working to prevent from reaching them. The specific brutalities the documentation describes are in the record. They have been in the record since the Morton book's publication in 1992. They are in the record now with the additional context of the recordings that Morton published after Diana's death, with the corroboration of the subsequent accounts from people whose proximity to the relevant situations gave their observations the weight of external confirmation. The man the documentation describes is now king. The documentation remains. The record contains both. The word brutal requires the same examination here that the word merciless required in the Anne account and the word nasty required in the Camilla and William accounts. Each of these words is chosen by a person who has been inside the proximity and who has selected the word that most accurately describes what the proximity showed them. Each word carries the weight of the selection, the weight of someone who has processed the experience and reduced it to its most accurate form before naming it. The naming is the documentation's most significant act, because the naming transforms the private experience from the shapeless accumulation of lived difficulty into the specific, accessible, communicable fact of a description that other people can receive and evaluate. Brutal describes something that the gentler vocabulary of the public register's account of Charles does not permit. The public register's account had the vocabulary of a complex man, intellectually serious but emotionally complicated, sensitive in certain contexts but difficult in others, a man whose private life had its difficulties but whose public achievements and genuine commitment to his causes were the defining features of his public identity. The complex man vocabulary is the vocabulary of the management apparatus's most sophisticated operation. The acknowledgement of a certain level of difficulty, sufficient to prevent the complete denial of what the private knowledge contained, while ensuring that the acknowledgement remains within the range of the ordinary human complexity that does not require the public to reassess its purchase of the public register's account. Brutal is outside that range. Brutal does not describe ordinary human complexity. It describes the specific quality of behavior whose distinguishing characteristic is the deliberate, directed infliction of damage on the person on the receiving end of the behavior. Damage that the person doing the inflicting understands they are inflicting and that the infliction is designed to produce. Diana's documentation describes this quality. not in the explicit terms that would constitute a formal accusation. The documentation is not a legal document, and the evidential standards it is held to are the evidential standards of first-person testimony rather than the evidential standards of a legal proceeding. But in the specific terms of direct personal experience, the documentation describes encounters whose quality has the character of deliberate directed damage, rather than the character of the ordinary relational difficulty that the complex man vocabulary accommodates. The specific brutalities the documentation describes fall into several distinct categories that the available record allows identification of. The first category is what might be called intellectual brutality. The specific targeted communication of Diana's intellectual inadequacy in the private register, deployed in the context where the assessment would cause the most damage. The context of Diana's own genuine interest or engagement, where the dismissal of the engagement as inadequate was most costly, because it was most specifically aimed at the dimension of Diana's self-expression that she was most invested in. Diana was not unintelligent. The people who knew her, who worked with her, who engaged with her on subjects she cared about, consistently described someone whose intelligence was real and whose specific kind of intelligence, the emotional, relational, socially attuned intelligence that the public's experience of Diana confirmed, was genuine and considerable. The management apparatus had spent years managing this intelligence out of the official account, because the official account required Diana to occupy the supporting figure position in the narrative rather than the position of a genuine intellectual presence whose engagement with the world was comparable to Charles's own. The managing of Diana's intelligence out of the official account served the specific purpose of confirming Charles as the intellectual presence in the marriage. The reformed heir's narrative required his intellectual seriousness to be the defining feature of the union, which required Diana's intellectual contributions to be subordinate to his. The management was institutional. The public account of the marriage was shaped by the institutional requirement rather than by the actual distribution of intellectual quality between the two people inside it. In the private register, the managing of Diana's intelligence out of the account took a different form, where the institutional management of the public account simply omitted Diana's intellectual contribution. The private register's management was more active, more directly engaged with the specific communication of Diana's intellectual inadequacy as an assessment rather than as an omission. The exchanges Diana described in the sessions had the specific quality of someone who was making a point of communicating the inadequacy, who was not simply failing to acknowledge Diana's intelligence, but was actively communicating its absence in terms designed to be received as the assessment rather than as the incidental product of someone whose engagement was not directed at Diana's intelligence at all. The directedness is the distinction between ordinary dismissiveness and the specific quality the word describes. Dismissiveness is the failure to engage with someone's contribution to a conversation or a relationship, the quality of not receiving what the other person is offering, whether through distraction or through genuine indifference to the contribution. The specific quality Diana's documentation describes was directed, was aimed at the specific dimension of Diana's self-presentation that she was most invested in, with the specific quality of communication designed to produce in her the assessment of her own inadequacy that Charles was directing at her. The second category is the emotional brutality, the specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana's emotional experience in the private register, in the contexts where the emotional experience was expressed, and where the engagement had the quality of not just failing to provide the response that genuine partnership would have provided, but of providing the specific opposite of that response. The specific opposite is the active diminishment of the emotional experience, the communication, in response to Diana's expression of her emotional reality, that the emotional reality is not a valid report of a real experience, but the product of the distorted perception that the management apparatus's positioning was simultaneously preparing as the discrediting strategy's available weapon. The communication of this in the private register, the specific response to Diana's emotional expression that told her that what she was feeling was not what was happening, is the specific form of the emotional brutality that the documentation describes and that the preceding accounts in this series have identified incomparable terms in comparable situations. The gaslighting dimension, the specific management of Diana's perception of her own experience in ways designed to make her doubt the reliability of that perception, is the most damaging form of the emotional brutality because it does not target the experience itself, but the experiencer's ability to trust their own experience. The targeting produces the specific damage of making the person inside the experience doubt whether what they are experiencing is real, whether the accumulation of the private register's specific qualities they have been mapping is the reliable record of what has been happening, or the product of the distortion the other party is communicating as the explanation for their perception. Diana's documentation of the gaslighting dimension is among the most significant of the documentation's specific contributions to the record. The documentation is itself the counter to the gaslighting. The production of a record by a person who has been told their perception is unreliable is the specific act of insisting on the reliability of the perception against the communication that it is not reliable. The record's existence is the argument that the perception was trustworthy, that what Diana was experiencing was what she was experiencing, and that the documentation of it in the specific, detailed, unmediated form of the sessions was the evidence of its reality. The third category is the social brutality, the specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana in the social context that the marriage produced, where the public register's requirements were partially relaxed, but the full privacy of the domestic register was not present, and where the specific communication of Diana's inadequacy was most available to the people in the social environment who were present for the communication. The social contexts, the aristocratic gatherings, the country house weekends, the events of the social world that both parties inhabited were the context where the private register's qualities were most visible to the people around the marriage. The specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana in these contexts, the dismissal, the condescension, the specific management of Diana's contribution to the social interactions in ways that communicated the assessment of her inadequacy to the people present, is documented by people who were in those contexts and whose accounts constitute the external confirmation of what the documentation describes from the inside. The external confirmation is significant as corroboration. The documentation is Diana's direct testimony, the first-person account of someone inside the experience. The external confirmation is the account of people who observed the same experiences from outside, who witnessed the specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana in the social contexts, and who formed, from their witnessing, the assessment that the documentation's internal account describes from inside. The corroboration is not uniformly available in the public record. The social code of the aristocratic world that produced the corroborating witnesses operates with the specific effectiveness that this series has described across multiple accounts to manage the corroborating witnesses' potential accounts into the silence of the private sphere. But the semi-public record contains enough of the corroboration. In the oblique, carefully hedged accounts of people who were present in the relevant social context and who have described what they observed in the specific language of the social world's management of sensitive information, to establish the consistency between the internal documentation and the external observation. The fourth category is the strategic brutality, the specific calculated use of Camilla as an instrument of psychological pressure on Diana in the private register. This dimension of the documentation is distinct from the simple fact of the parallel relationship. The fact of Camilla's ongoing primacy in Charles's emotional life and the cost that this imposed on Diana, which has been described in preceding accounts in this series. The strategic brutality is the specific deployment of the parallel relationship as a weapon in the private register's dynamics, the specific communication of Camilla's presence and primacy in ways designed to maximize the psychological damage rather than simply the inevitable consequence of the situation's facts. The communication was not always explicit. It did not require the explicit statement of Camilla's presence and primacy to function as the communication of that presence and primacy. It operated through the specific qualities of behavior that communicated the assessment. The withdrawal of engagement after calls that Diana understood were from Camilla, the specific quality of comparison that operated in the private register's communication of Diana's inadequacy, the specific occasions when the communication of the parallel relationship's primacy was the deliberate direction of the private register at the specific psychological dimension where the damage would be most acute. Diana documented all four categories. The documentation is not a comprehensive transcript of every exchange and every experience in the marriage private reality. It is the documentation of a person who was producing a record rather than an archive, who was making decisions about what the record required to contain and what the record's purpose required to emphasize. The decisions were made with the awareness that the documentation needed to achieve a specific purpose, the purpose of making the private reality available to the public in a form that the management apparatus's discrediting strategy could not reduce to the product of distorted perception. The documentation achieved this purpose. Not completely. The management apparatus's deployment of the complex man vocabulary and the discrediting strategy's positioning of Diana's reliability had sufficient reach to maintain the doubt among people who were committed to the doubt, but sufficiently for the public that received the documentation, through the Morton book and through the Bashir interview, to have access to the specific, detailed first-person account of the private reality that the management apparatus had been working to prevent from reaching them. The specific brutalities the documentation describes are in the record. They have been in the record since the Morton book's publication in 1992. They are in the record now, with the additional context of the recordings that Morton published after Diana's death, with the corroboration of the subsequent accounts from people whose proximity to the relevant situations gave their observations the weight of external confirmation. The man the documentation describes is now king. The documentation remains. The record contains both. Diana did not document alone. The documentation she produced, the Morton recordings, the Bashir interview, the specific first-person testimony that she placed in the public record through the deliberate, careful, controlled process this account's preceding parts have described, was the documentation of an insider. The insider's testimony is the most direct and most authoritative form of documentation available, because the insider is the person whose experience of the private reality is most complete and most specific and most resistant to the management apparatus's discrediting strategies. But the insider's documentation does not stand entirely alone in the record. It stands alongside the documentation that the witnesses produced, the people whose proximity to the private reality, while less complete than Diana's own, was sufficient to constitute corroborating observation that the management apparatus was less equipped to suppress than it was to suppress Diana's direct testimony. The witnesses were of several kinds, and each kind produced a different form of the corroborating observation that the record contains in the partial and oblique form that the management apparatus' management of the information environment allowed to survive. The first kind was the household staff, the specific people whose professional proximity to the Wales household in its Kensington, Palace and Highgrove and Balmoral dimensions gave them the most sustained and most comprehensive observation of the private register's expression in the daily texture of the marriage life. The staff were present in the morning, in the evenings, in the private domestic spaces between the public program's engagements, in the specific contexts where the public register was not required and where the private register's qualities were most available for direct observation. What the staff saw was the private register, not all dimensions of it. The staff's professional code required the maintenance of a specific invisibility in the household's social dynamics, the specific non-engagement with what they observed that the service tradition demands. But the observation was present regardless of the non-engagement, and the observation produced its own form of documentation in the private knowledge of the people whose professional lives were spent in the proximity that produced it. The specific staff accounts that the semi-public record contains are accounts from people who had left the household, who had departed in the various forms that household departures take, some through the managed exits that Part 6's description of the management apparatus's operation explains, and some through the ordinary attrition of service that is the normal pattern of professional lives in the relevant world, and who carried in their private knowledge the specific observations their service had produced. Paul Burrell's accounts are the most extensively documented of the staff accounts in the public record. Most extensively because Burrell eventually chose to place a version of his observations in the public domain through the memoir and the subsequent media appearances that the palace's legal management could partially but not completely prevent. Burrell's proximity to Diana was exceptional. He was her personal butler, the person whose professional role required the most direct and most continuous proximity to the principal's personal life of all the household roles. The proximity gave him observation of dimensions of the private reality that most other staff members did not have access to. What Burrell documented is not uniformly the documentation of Charles's private register. Burrell's account focuses substantially on Diana's experience rather than on the specific qualities of Charles's behavior, which is the natural consequence of a loyalty that was primarily to Diana rather than to the institution, and that produced an account organized around Diana's well-being rather than around the comprehensive documentation of Charles's private character. But the specific dimension of Burrell's account that engages with the private register's expression in Diana's daily experience is consistent with the documentation Diana herself produced. Consistent in the specific sense that the observations from the outside of Diana's household experience corroborate the observations from the inside that the Morton sessions and the Bashir interview contain. Other staff accounts, less public, less extensively documented, present in the semi-public record in the oblique and partial form that the staff's NDAs and professional codes produce, are consistent with the same pattern. The accounts from people whose professional roles place them in the household's specific private spaces describe a household whose private register had the quality that Diana's documentation describes from inside. The specific temperature, the specific dynamics, the specific quality of the domestic environment that the background of the private register's consistent expression produces in the people who inhabit it daily. The second kind of witness was the friends, the specific group of people outside the institutional context whose relationship with Diana was sufficiently close and sufficiently trusted that Diana's private expressions of her experience reached them in forms more direct than the oblique communication that the household's managed environment permitted. The friends had a different form of access than the staff, not the direct observation of the household's daily private dynamics, but the communication of Diana's experience of those dynamics through Diana's own account of them, given in the specific context of the trusted private conversation that the code's management of the relevant world allowed. The friend's documentation is therefore the documentation of Diana's communication of her experience rather than the documentation of the experience itself. It has the form of second-hand testimony rather than the form of direct observation. The second-hand quality does not reduce the significance of the friend's accounts in the corroborating record. The specific consistency between Diana's direct testimony in the Morton sessions and the Bashir interview and the accounts of friends who had received Diana's private communication of her experience across the relevant years is itself evidentially significant. The consistency between what Diana said in the controlled documentation of the sessions and what she communicated in the private context of trusted friendships, without the specific awareness that the private communications might eventually reach the public record, is the consistency of someone whose account is not shaped by the anticipated public reception of that account, but by the ongoing reality of what the experience contained. The friends' accounts reach the semi-public record through the same mechanisms that all private knowledge reaches the semi-public record in the relevant worlds, through the chains of private conversation information from the most proximate circles to the less proximate circles, and from the less proximate circles to the edges of the mainstream record in the oblique and partial form that the social code and the management apparatus operation. Several of Diana's friends have provided accounts, in the specific contexts that the code's management allows, in the careful language of people who are communicating what they know through the mechanisms that their world has developed for this communication, that are consistent with the direct documentation Diana produced. The consistency across the friends' accounts is among the semi-public record's most significant features. The friends were not in contact with each other in ways that would have allowed coordination of their accounts. They were in contact with Diana, separately, in the private contexts of individual trusted relationships. The consistency of their accounts is therefore the consistency of multiple independent recipients of the same private communication about the same sustained experience, the consistency that reliable testimony produces when it is received by multiple independent witnesses who have no mechanism for producing a coordinated account. The third kind of witness was the social world, the aristocratic and upper-class social world that the Wales marriage inhabited across its duration. The country house circuit, the formal events and the informal gatherings, the specific social geography of the world that both Charles and Diana moved through, produced the most public and most visible form of the corroborating observation, because the social world's observations were made in the semi-public contexts of the social occasions rather than in the fully private contexts of the household or the trusted private conversation. What the social world observed was the specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana in the social register. The public social register, which was less managed than the fully public register of the official engagements, but more managed than the fully private register of the household's domestic life. The social register's specific position between the fully public and the fully private gave the social world's observers access to a dimension of the private register's expression that neither the staff nor the trusted friends had access to in the same form. The dimension of Charles's engagement with Diana in the presence of others who were not inside the management apparatus, but who were inside the specific social world that both parties inhabited. The social world's observations are among the most extensively documented in the semi-public record, because the social world's management of the information it generates is less complete than the management of the households or the trusted private conversations information. The country house weekend has its social code, but the social code of the country house weekend does not produce the same completeness of managed silence that the institutional code of the royal household or the NDA of the managed departure produces. Information from the social world moves more freely, in the oblique and careful language of the relevant world, into the semi-public form that the semi-public record is built from. What moved from the social world into the semi-public record was consistent with what the staff and the friends and Diana's own documentation describe: the specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana in the social contexts that the country house circuit produced, the dismissal expressed through the quality of the attention Charles brought to the social interactions when Diana was the focus of other guests' engagement, the specific register of someone who was not comfortable with the attention Diana's presence attracted, and who communicated this discomfort through the quality of his own engagement with her in the social context. The condescension expressed through the specific quality of Charles's management of Diana's contributions to the social conversations, the management of her engagement with the social interactions in ways that communicated to the people present that Diana's contribution was not on the same level as Charles's own. The social world saw this. It saw it across the years of the marriage social engagement with the country house circuit and the aristocratic milieu. It held what it saw in the private knowledge that the social code manages, in the oblique, unspoken, collectively maintained awareness of what the marriage social register communicated about the marriage private reality. It carried that awareness into the semi-public record through the mechanisms of the private knowledge's gradual movement toward the edges of the mainstream. The movement was slow. The social code is effective at slowing the movement of private knowledge toward the mainstream. But the movement happened in the partial and oblique form that the semi-public record preserves, and the form it preserved is consistent with the direct documentation Diana produced and the staff and friends' accounts that the semi-public record contains alongside it. The women who witnessed what Diana documented, the staff and the friends and the social world observers, are the external corroboration that the documentation's internal account requires to constitute the full record. The full record contains the internal account and the external corroboration in the specific form that the management apparatus's operation allowed both to achieve. The management apparatus managed the corroboration as it managed the documentation itself. into the semi-public record, into the partial and oblique form, into the space between fully private and fully public, where the management's reach is sufficient to prevent the full mainstream visibility, but insufficient to prevent the survival of the account. In the form the semi-public record preserves, the survival is the record. The record holds the witnesses alongside Diana. The witnesses corroborate. The corroboration is here. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The relationship between Charles and Camilla has been described in preceding accounts in this series in terms that engage with its specific character and its specific impact on Diana. Those accounts established the relationship's duration, its primacy in Charles's emotional life, the specific cost it imposed on the marriage and on the woman inside the marriage who carried the knowledge of its existence, alongside the requirement to maintain the official account of a union that the private reality did not correspond to. This part engages with something different, something that the preceding accounts have approached, but not fully addressed. Not the relationship itself and its existence and its cost, the specific way that the relationship was used, deliberately, strategically, in the private register of the marriage daily dynamics, as an instrument of psychological pressure on Diana. The distinction between the existence of the parallel relationship and the deliberate deployment of the parallel relationship as a weapon in the marriage private dynamics is the distinction this part is built around. The existence imposed a cost on Diana that was unavoidable. The cost of knowing about the relationship, of carrying that knowledge, of living inside a marriage whose private reality was fundamentally different from its official account. This cost was the cost of the situation's facts, not the cost of a specific deliberate act directed at Diana. The facts imposed the cost. The deliberate deployment imposed a different and additional cost. The specific use of the relationship's existence as an instrument. The specific communication of the relationship's primacy over the marriage in ways designed to maximize the psychological damage to Diana, rather than simply as the inevitable consequence of the situation's facts, is the specific brutality this part of the documentation addresses. Diana's documentation of this dimension is among the most significant of the documentation's specific contributions, because it is the dimension most directly relevant to the assessment of the specific character of the man the documentation describes. The existence of the parallel relationship reveals something about Charles's priorities in his formation and his specific version of the aristocratic male's relationship to marital fidelity. The deliberate deployment of the parallel relationship as an instrument against Diana reveals something about the specific character of his engagement with the woman he was married to, about whether the cost to her was a matter of indifference to him or a matter of deliberate direction. The documentation describes the latter. The instruments through which the parallel relationship was deployed as psychological pressure were several, and they operated at different levels of directness and explicitness. The most implicit operated through the quality of the private register's emotional temperature, the specific way that Charles's engagement with Diana in the domestic private space shifted according to the presence or absence of the Camilla communication in the surrounding period. The evenings after the calls had a specific quality that Diana documented, the quality of someone whose primary emotional attention was elsewhere, whose engagement with the domestic environment was perfunctory in the way that the management of an obligation produces when the obligation is managed rather than inhabited, whose communication with Diana in the post-call period had the temperature of someone who had been where they most wanted to be, and was now managing the return to the arrangement they had not chosen. The implicit communication was the communication of the parallel relationship's primacy over the marriage, not through explicit statement, which would have required Charles to acknowledge the parallel relationship in the terms that would have constituted an acknowledgement with consequences, but through the specific quality of the private register's expression in the relevant contexts. The communication was implicit, but it was not unconscious. Diana's documentation describes the implicit communication with the specific precision of someone who has been receiving it long enough to understand its specific structure to understand that the quality of the post-call engagement was not the incidental product of someone whose emotional state happened to be different after the calls, but the deliberate communication of the parallel relationship through the specific withholding of the engagement that the marriage official account required to be present. The withholding is deliberate when the person doing the withholding understands what the withholding can communicate and chooses to communicate it. Diana's documentation describes the deliberateness, the specific quality of the withholding that distinguished it from the ordinary variability of someone whose private temperament is more available in certain contexts than others, and that established it as the directed communication of a specific assessment rather than the incidental product of someone's private emotional rhythms. The second instrument was more explicit, the specific deployment of Camilla's name and presence in the marriage's private dynamics in ways that were designed to establish the parallel relationship's primacy in explicit terms rather than through the implicit quality of the post-call private register. Diana's documentation describes specific instances, the specific occasions when the parallel relationship was named or referenced in the private register, in ways that were not the inadvertent mention of someone whose presence in Charles's life was unavoidable, but the deliberate insertion of the parallel relationship into the private dynamics of the marriage at the specific moments and in the specific ways that would cause the most damage to Diana's experience of the marriage. The deliberate insertion is the specific form of the brutality this account's title names, not the existence of the parallel relationship, which imposed its own cost without requiring deliberate direction at Diana. The specific, deliberate, repeated insertion of the parallel relationship into the marriage's private dynamics in ways designed to communicate to Diana that the relationship she was inside was less important, less primary, less valued by the person she was married to than the parallel relationship that existed alongside it. The psychological effect of this specific form of communication on Diana was the effect that Diana's documentation is described in the specific terms of someone whose self-perception and sense of the reality she was inhabiting were systematically subjected to a pressure designed to undermine both. The self-perception undermining operated through the communication of Diana's inadequacy. The implicit comparison through the parallel relationship's deployment between Diana's qualities as a partner and Camilla's qualities as a partner, in ways that consistently communicated Diana's inferiority in the assessment of the man who was simultaneously required to be publicly present in the marriage and privately invested in the parallel relationship. The reality undermining operated through the gaslighting dimension that Part 5 of this account described. The specific management of Diana's perception of what she was experiencing in ways designed to make her doubt whether the experience was as real and as specifically directed as her documentation was insisting it was. The deployment of the parallel relationship as an instrument included the specific deployment of the denial of the instrument's existence as a supplementary weapon. The specific communication when Diana's perception of the parallel relationship's deployment was expressed, that the perception was not an accurate report of what was happening, but the product of the instability that the management apparatus was simultaneously preparing as the discrediting strategy's available weapon. The convergence of the parallel relationship's deployment and the denial of the deployment's existence is the specific form of the psychological brutality that the documentation describes most completely. Diana was inside the experience of the parallel relationship's deliberate deployment as a psychological instrument and simultaneously inside the communication that the experience was not real, that what she was perceiving was not what was happening, but the product of her own distorted perception. The convergence produced the specific psychological experience of someone who is being gaslit, whose reliable perception of their own reality is being systematically challenged by the person in the closest proximity who has the most direct interest in the challenge's success. Diana's documentation resisted this convergence. The documentation was, among other things, the specific act of insisting on the reliability of the perception against the communication that it was not reliable, the specific counter to the gaslighting dimension of the instrument's deployment. By producing the documentation in the specific form she produced it, the careful, detailed, present, Specific first-person testimony of a woman who was in full possession of her faculties and speaking about her experience with the precision of someone who trusted her own perception of what she was experiencing. Diana was creating the evidence that her perception was reliable, that what she was experiencing was what she said she was experiencing, that the deployment of the parallel relationship as a psychological instrument was the reality of her experience and not the distortion of an unstable perception. The third instrument was the social deployment, the specific ways that the parallel relationship's existence and primacy was made present to Diana in the social context of the aristocratic world that both parties inhabited. The country house weekends, the social gatherings, the specific occasions when Camilla's presence in the social world that Charles and Diana both moved through was managed in ways that were designed to communicate the parallel relationships stand to Diana in the presence of the people whose observation of the communication was itself a dimension of the pressure. The social deployment had the specific quality of directed humiliation, the communication of the parallel relationship's primacy in front of people whose presence transformed the communication from private pressure to a form of public pressure, in the specific sense of public that the aristocratic social world's semi-private gatherings represent. Diana's documentation of the social deployment describes the specific occasions when Charles's management of his and Diana's respective positions in the social context of gatherings where Camilla was present had the quality of confirming the parallel relationships standing in ways that were visible to the social world's observers and that therefore imposed the additional cost of witnessed humiliation on top of the direct psychological pressure. The witnessed humiliations is the most socially significant form of the instrument's deployment because it extends the pressure beyond the private sphere of the marriage's domestic dynamics into the semi-public sphere of the social world, into the space where the social world's observers could receive what they were witnessing and carry it into the private knowledge that the relevant world maintains about the people and the dynamics it observes. The social world carried it. The semi-public record contains the social world's observation of the dynamics in the oblique and partial form that the relevant world's management of its private knowledge produces, and the form is consistent with what Diana's direct documentation describes from inside the dynamics. Camilla was the instrument, not the only instrument. The documentation describes multiple forms of the psychological pressure and multiple instruments of its application. But the specific instrument whose deployment was most deliberate and most sustained and most damaging in its specific psychological impact on Diana. The documentation of the instrument's use is the documentation of something about the man who used it that the public register's account of the sensitive prince and the complex man and the reformed heir could not accommodate. The documentation is in the record. The man is on the throne. The record holds both. William was born on the 21st of June 1982, Harry on the 15th of September 1984. They were born into the private reality that this account has been describing, not into the public account of the reformed heir and the sensitive prince and the perfect public marriage that the institution had been managing the public toward receiving, but into the household whose private register had the qualities that Diana's documentation describes and that the preceding parts of this account have been building toward through the establishment of the context and the character and the specific instruments of the private reality's expression. The household was the children's world, not metaphorically, literally. The specific physical and social and emotional environment of the household was the world in which William and Harry's formation happened in the most fundamental sense that the formation always happens in the world that the child's earliest and most sustained experience constitutes. The household's atmosphere, its temperature, its specific dynamics between the primary adults who occupied it. These were not the background of the children's formation, but the formation itself, the environment that shaped the specific people they became in the ways that the primary environment always shapes the people formed inside it. What the household's atmosphere communicated to the children was not directly available to them in the form that the documentation makes it available to adults who read it. Children do not receive the household's dynamics through the analytical framework that adult reflection on childhood experience provides. They receive them through the embodied, unreflective pre-linguistic absorption that the developmental psychology of early childhood has documented across multiple decades of research. The absorption of the emotional temperature environment, the forming of the understanding of what relationships are and how they operate, the building of the specific relational templates that the primary relationships produce in the children who are inside them. The embodied absorption does not require understanding. William did not need to understand what his parents' marriage contained in the specific terms that Diana's documentation makes available to the adult reader. In order to absorb the atmosphere the marriage produced, and to form the relational templates that the atmosphere communicated, he absorbed the atmosphere, as simply how the household was a condition of the primary environment, as the world before the comparison with any other world was available, that would have produced the understanding that the atmosphere was a specific thing rather than simply the world. Harry was younger when the marriage's dynamics were at their most acute. His developmental stage during the period of the marriage's most intense documentation was the developmental stage at which the embodied absorption is most complete and most formative, the stage at which the relational templates are being laid down in the most fundamental form, when the household is not a background condition of daily life, but the entire world, when the primary adult's dynamics are not one dimension of a complex environment, but the defining feature of the world. The developmental difference between the two brothers means their absorptions were different in specific ways, while sharing the fundamental character of the same household atmosphere. William, older and cognitively more developed during the period of the marriage's most acute dynamics, absorbed more of the explicit dimensions of what the household contained, had more of the cognitive framework available to begin organizing the absorption into something approaching conscious awareness, even without the analytical framework that adult reflection would eventually provide. Harry absorbed more completely in the pre-linguistic embodied form that the youngest children's absorption takes, the form that is most complete precisely because it is least filtered by the cognitive processing that older children apply to their environmental absorption. The difference matters for understanding the subsequent divergence in how the two brothers related to the institution and to the private reality of the household as adults. William's conscious awareness of more of the explicit dimensions of what the household contained, without the full analytical framework available until adulthood, produced a specific relationship to the institution's management of that private reality, a relationship that could be incorporated into the institutional framework, because the conscious awareness, arriving in the context of an institutional formation that required its management, was managed alongside the institutional requirements. Harry's more complete embodied absorption, operating below the level of the cognitive processing that might have been managed into the institutional framework's requirements, produced the specific kind of adult knowledge whose origin was the body rather than the mind, and that was therefore less susceptible to the institutional formation's management. The specific ways that the absorption expressed itself in the two brothers' adult lives are part of the public record in the form that this series has addressed across multiple preceding accounts. William's specific relationship to the institution's requirements and the specific ways that the institutional formation has shaped his adult engagement with the dynasty's legacy. Harry's specific relationship to the private knowledge and the specific ways that the adult articulation of the embodied absorption produced the public break with the institutional framework that this series has discussed. But before the adult expression, there was the absorption. The absorption happened in the household. The household had the specific character this account has been describing. The character was the character of the private register, the dismissal, the condescension, the emotional distance, the strategic deployment of the parallel relationship as an instrument of psychological pressure, the specific atmosphere of a domestic environment in which the official account's warmth and partnership were not the private reality. The children absorbed this atmosphere in their respective developmental forms. William absorbed the awareness of a household whose temperature was different from the official account's warmth. Harry absorbed the embodied reality of a household whose emotional dynamics were organized around the dynamics this account describes. both absorptions produced in the adults, the two brothers became the specific relational templates that the household's atmosphere communicated, the templates that shaped how they understood relationships and institutions, and the distance between managed accounts and private realities. The specific templates are not identical. The same household, absorbed through different developmental stages and different temperamental sensitivities, produces different templates in different children. William's template included the specific awareness of the management operation, the institutional formations product, the understanding that the gap between official account and private reality was a manageable gap, that the management required specific skills that the institutional formation provided, and that the institutional role required. Harry's template included the specific embodied knowledge that the gap existed and was real and was costly to the people inside it. The knowledge that precedes the analytical framework, and that is therefore less susceptible to the institutional management shaping. Diana shaped both templates. She was the primary source of warmth and genuine connection in the household, that the private register's qualities had made the dominant emotional environment. Diana's specific engagement with her sons, the physical expressiveness, the deliberate choice of the child's perspective over the managed adult's perspective, the specific quality of genuine presence that made her relationship with her children the most unmanaged relationship in her institutional life, was the counter-atmosphere to the private register's qualities. The counter-atmosphere was real and significant. It meant that the household was not simply the private register's atmosphere without relief, that there was a genuine warmth available in the primary relationship with the mother that the father's private register did not provide. The developmental psychology of children in households with significant primary adult relationship difficulties is not the developmental psychology of children in households where all the primary relationships are damaged. The availability of one genuinely warm, genuinely present, genuinely attuned primary relationship can constitute a significant protective factor against the formation of the most damaging relational templates. Diana was that protective factor for her sons. The specific quality of her engagement with them, the quality that Part 10 of the preceding Diana account in this series has described in the context of her choices about motherhood, and what those choices communicated about her values and her priorities, was the countervailing force against the private register's atmosphere in the children's formation. But the protective factor was not absolute. The household's dominant dynamics were still the household's dominant dynamics, and the children were inside them, regardless of the countervailing force of Diana's specific engagement with them. They absorbed what the absorption produces, the templates of the primary relationships, shaped by the full character of the household's atmosphere, and not only by the specific relationship with the protective primary figure. Charles was less directly available to his sons as a primary relationship in the specific sense that his emotional availability to Diana in the private register was limited. The emotional availability to his sons was different. The accounts of people who observed Charles with his children in the relevant period describe someone whose engagement with them had genuine moments of warmth, whose investment in their development was real in the specific ways that his formation and his genuine love for the children permitted its expression. The genuine moments were real. The emotional register that produced them was also the emotional register that the private register's qualities expressed in the marriage. Not a different register deployed for the children, but the same register, with its contextual availability and its intermittent quality, applied in the parental context. The children received what the register produced in them, the genuine moments alongside the intermittent quality, the specific formation of the two primary adults' combined dynamics in the household's atmosphere, the absorption that the developmental stage and the temperamental sensitivity of each child produced from the same primary environment, carries the absorption in the specific form of the adult who has incorporated the household's dynamics into an institutional framework that provides the management mechanisms for what the absorption produced, who has the institutional skills and the institutional formation to manage the gap between the official account and the private reality in the manner the institutional role requires. Harry carries the absorption in the specific form of the adult, who articulated the embodied knowledge that the household's dynamics had deposited in him through the developmental absorption, who broke with the institutional framework that would have required the continued management of the gap and chose instead the public acknowledgement of what the gap contained and what it had cost. The household produced both. The private register was what both absorbed. Diana's countervailing warmth was what both remember alongside it. The combination is the formation. The formation produced the adults. The adults are in the world. What they carry from the household is in the world with them. The 20th of November 1995 was a Tuesday. The word brutal requires the same examination here that the word merciless required in the Anne account and the word nasty required in the Camilla and William accounts. Each of these words is chosen by a person who has been inside the proximity and who has selected the word that most accurately describes what the proximity showed them. Each word carries the weight of the selection, the weight of someone who has processed the experience and reduced it to its most accurate form before naming it. The naming is the documentation's most significant act, because the naming transforms the private experience from the shapeless accumulation of lived difficulty into the specific, accessible, communicable fact of a description that other people can receive and evaluate. Brutal describes something that the gentler vocabulary of the public register's account of Charles does not permit. The public register's account had the vocabulary of a complex man, intellectually serious but emotionally complicated, sensitive in certain contexts but difficult in others, a man whose private life had its difficulties but whose public achievements and genuine commitment to his causes were the defining features of his public identity. The complex man vocabulary is the vocabulary of the management apparatus' most sophisticated operation. The acknowledgement of a certain level of difficulty, sufficient to prevent the complete denial of what the private knowledge contained, while ensuring that the acknowledgement remains within the range of the ordinary human complexity that does not require the public vow to reassess its purchase of the public register's account. Brutal is outside that range. Brutal does not describe ordinary human complexity. It describes the specific quality of behavior whose distinguishing characteristic is the deliberate, directed infliction of damage on the person on the receiving end of the behavior. Damage that the person doing the inflicting understands they are inflicting and that the infliction is designed to produce. Diana's documentation describes this quality, not in the explicit terms that would constitute a formal accusation. The documentation is not a legal document, and the evidential standards it is held to are the evidential standards of first-person testimony rather than the evidential standards of a legal proceeding. But in the specific terms of direct personal experience, the documentation describes encounters whose quality has the character of deliberate directed damage rather than the character of the ordinary relational difficulty that the complex man vocabulary accommodates. The specific brutalities the documentation describes fall into several distinct categories that the available record allows identification of. The first category is what might be called intellectual brutality. The specific targeted communication of Diana's intellectual inadequacy in the private register, deployed in the contexts where the assessment would cause the most damage, the context of Diana's own genuine interest or engagement, where the dismissal of the engagement as inadequate was most costly because it was most specifically aimed at the dimension of Diana's self-expression that she was most invested in. Diana was not unintelligent. The people who knew her, who worked with her, who engaged with her on subjects she cared about, consistently described someone whose intelligence was real and whose specific kind of intelligence, the emotional, relational, socially attuned intelligence that the public's experience of Diana confirmed, was genuine and considerable. The management apparatus had spent years managing this intelligence out of the official account, because the official account required Diana to occupy the supporting figure position in the narrative rather than the position of a genuine intellectual presence whose engagement with the world was comparable to Charles's own. The managing of Diana's intelligence out of the official account served the specific purpose of confirming Charles as the intellectual presence in the marriage. The reformed heir's narrative required his intellectual seriousness to be the defining feature of the union. which required Diana's intellectual contribution to be subordinate to his. The management was institutional. The public contends were shaped by the institutional requirement rather than by the actual distribution of intellectual quality between the two people inside it. In the private register, the managing of Diana's intelligence out of the account took a different form, where the institutional management of the public account simply omitted Diana's intellectual contribution. The private register's management was more active, more directly engaged with the specific communication of Diana's intellectual inadequacy as an assessment rather than as an omission. The exchanges Diana described in the sections had the specific quality of someone who was making a point of communicating the inadequacy, who was not simply failing to acknowledge Diana's intelligence, but was actively communicating its absence in terms designed to be received as the assessment. Rather than engagement was not directed at Diana's intelligence. The directedness is the distinction between ordinary dismissiveness and the specific quality the word describes. Dismissiveness is the failure to engage with someone's contribution to a conversation or a relationship. The quality of not receiving what the other person is offering, whether through distraction or through genuine indifference to the contribution. The specific quality Diana's documentation describes was aimed at the specific dimension of Diana's self-presentation that she was most invested in, with the specific quality of communication designed to produce in her the assessment of her own inadequacy that Charles was directing at her. The second category is the emotional brutality. In the specific temporal geography of the Wales marriage public history, Tuesday, the 20th of November 1995, is the date that functions as the divide. The specific point at which the documentation that Diana had been producing across years of careful, deliberate, strategically managed effort achieved the form that the documentation had always been moving toward. The form was not the cassette tapes, or the Morton book, or the private conversations with the trusted friends, or the social world's accumulated private knowledge. All of those forms had been building toward this one. The form was Diana herself, in her own face, in her own voice, speaking directly to an audience of 23 million people about what her marriage had actually been. The Bashir interview was not the beginning of the documentation. It was the documentation's culmination, the specific form that everything preceding it had been building toward, and that the preceding forms had been necessary conditions for achieving. The Morton book had established the existence of the documentation and had placed it in the public sphere in a form that the management apparatus had managed to contest through the counter-narrative's deployment. The Bashir interview made the contestation impossible, not because the interview's content was more extreme than the Morton book's content. The interview's content was less extreme than the Morton book's in several specific dimensions, less detailed about certain aspects of the private register's expression, less specific about certain instances of the behavior the documentation describes, more focused on the emotional experience of being inside the marriage's private reality than on the catalogue of the specific behaviors that produced the experience. The interview's content was the content of someone who had learned from the Morton book's reception what the documentation required to achieve its purpose and what was unnecessary for the purpose's achievement. What the interview added to the Morton book's content was not more documentation, but the form that made the documentation undeniable.
On camera, Diana in her own face.
Diana speaking in the specific voice that 25 years of public life had made familiar to 23 million people who had formed their own relationship with her through that voice's expression across those years. The form was the undeniable addition, the specific, direct, named, public attribution of the documentation to its source, in the source's own voice, in the source's own presence, in the specific form that the management apparatus's counter-narrative required something more powerful than it possessed to challenge. The management apparatus did not possess something more powerful. Its counter-narrative required the positioning of the source as potentially unreliable. The source was on camera. The source was Diana, whom the 23 million people watching had been receiving as real across the preceding years of her public life, and whom they had formed their own assessment of in terms that the management apparatuses general unreliability positioning could not override in the specific moment of the interview's reception. The specific moment of the reception was the specific form that the documentation's achievement of its purpose took, not the subsequent analysis or the subsequent management of the interview's impact, or the subsequent management of the institutional response. All of those were the aftermath of the moment rather than the moment itself. The moment was the specific experience of 23 million people receiving Diana's direct testimony in real time, in the specific form of presence that television produces in the people watching it, with the specific quality of Diana's own voice and face, and the specific manner of speaking that the interview had, the composure, the clarity, the specific quality of someone who was saying what they wanted to say in the most accurate available terms, and who was not performing distress for effect, but was simply present to the description of what the experience had been. The composure was the interview's most significant formal quality for the purpose of the documentation's achievement. The management apparatus's counter-narrative had been building the instability positioning for years. The documentation of the mental health difficulties, the specific framing of Diana as a woman whose private instability made her an unreliable narrator of her own experience. The instability positioning required a visibly unstable target to function as intended. Diana on camera was composed, clear-eyed, specific in the detail, articulate in the description, and communicating the specific quality of someone who trusted her own perception of what she had experienced, and who was describing that perception in terms that the perception's accuracy produced, rather than in terms that the emotional charge of the experience's distortion produced. The composure directly undermined the instability positioning's most important requirement. The management apparatus could not position the woman on the screen in front of 23 million people as the visibly unstable narrator whose perception of her experience was distorted, because the woman on the screen was not visibly unstable. She was present, composed, specific, and the specific quality of the presence and the composure was the quality that the documentation's design had been building towards since the Morton sessions. The quality of someone whose perception of their own experience was reliable, and who was speaking about that experience in the terms that reliability produced. The specific content of the interview covered several dimensions of the documentation that the Morton book had established, and that the interview was extending rather than initiating. The three people in the marriage, the phrase whose compression of the complex reality of Diana's experience into the specific form that the general public could receive, without the detailed documentation that the specific form compressed, was among the interview's most significant formal achievements. The eating disorder acknowledged in the specific terms of someone who was accounting for their own experience rather than denying or managing it. An acknowledgement that the management apparatus's instability positioning had attempted to exploit as the evidence of unreliability, and that Diana converted, through the interview's specific handling of the acknowledgement, into the evidence of honest self-awareness rather than the evidence of unreliable perception. The bulimia acknowledgement is the specific instance where the interview's formal sophistication is most visible. The management apparatus had been positioning the eating disorder as the evidence of Diana's instability, and the instability as the evidence of her unreliability as a narrator of her own experience. Diana's direct acknowledgement of the eating disorder, in the interview's specific handling of the acknowledgement, converted the management apparatus's positioning into an argument for, rather than against, her reliability. The specific move of a woman who was not managing her account to protect herself from difficult dimensions of her own experience, but who was engaging directly with those dimensions in ways that the instability positioning could not accommodate, without simultaneously arguing that honest self-acknowledgement was itself evidence of instability. The specific phrase about Charles, "He was perfect in public and in private, he was a different person," is the interview's most direct statement of the documentation's central claim and its most significant formal addition to what the Morton book had established, not the most detailed statement. The Morton book's specific content was more detailed about the specific dimensions of the private register's qualities. The most direct statement, the compression of the documentation's central claim into the specific form that the general public could receive, without the detailed documentation that the specific form compressed, in the specific manner of Diana's own voice, giving the claim its most direct public expression. The directness is the interview's formal achievement over the Morton book's form. The Morton book's form required the reader to construct the central claim from the accumulated specific detail that the documentation contained. The interview's form allowed Diana to state the central claim directly, to place it in the public sphere, in the form of Diana's own voice saying the thing that the documentation had been building toward, and that the public reception of the interview confirmed the public was ready to receive. The public was ready because they had been receiving Diana across the preceding 14 years of her public life and had formed, through that receiving, the specific relationship with her that made their reception of the interview's content the reception of someone trusted rather than the reception of someone the management apparatus's positioning of unreliability was designed for. The trust was the specific condition that the documentation's design had been building toward, and that the 14 years of Diana's public life had been producing in the people who received her as real. The condition without which the interview's direct statement of the documentation's central claim would have been susceptible to the management apparatus positioning, and with which it was not. The interview aired at 9 o'clock in the evening on BBC One. The audience of 23 million was the largest for any BBC programme in the relevant period. The global audience was considerably larger. The institutional response was immediate in its assessment that the interview had achieved what Diana had designed it to achieve. The public establishment of the private reality's existence in a form that the official account could not continue to maintain. The institutional assessment produced the institutional response. The letter from the Queen advising early divorce, the announcement of the divorce proceedings, the management of the post-interview period through the formal institutional steps that the assessment required. The assessment was correct. The documentation had achieved its purpose. The private reality was public in the specific form that Diana had been designing toward since the Morton sessions. Charles's response to the interview was the response that the management apparatus' available tools allowed. The cultivation of sympathetic commentary, the management of the information environment around the interview's reception, the specific counter-narrative deployment that the available tools provided. The counter-narrative was less effective than its earlier deployments had been, because the interview's specific quality of Diana's direct presence made the unreliability positioning less credible than it had been against the Morton book's less direct form. The interview also produced, in Charles, the specific motivation to produce his own public account of the private reality. The motivation that resulted in the Jonathan Dimbleby documentary and biography of 1994, which was actually produced before the Bashir interview, but whose reception was significantly shaped by the interview's subsequent establishment of Diana's account as the dominant public narrative. The Dimbleby project was the management apparatus's most ambitious attempt to produce an alternative to Diana's account, the authorized account, the cooperative biography, the specific form of managed disclosure that the management apparatus had most control over. The Dimbleby project is significant for this account's purposes because it produced in the specific form of an authorized biography whose production Charles cooperated with and approved, the most explicit confirmation available from Charles himself that the private reality had documented was not the invention of an unstable narrator, but the specific reality of a marriage in which the official account had never corresponded to the private one. The Dimbleby biography confirmed, through the specific form of Charles's cooperation with its production, the central claim of Diana's documentation, that the official account of the marriage had been a managed surface and that the private reality was different from the surface in ways whose acknowledgement required, even in the most managed form of the authorized biography, the engagement with dimensions of the private reality that the official account had been working to prevent from reaching the public. The Dimbleby acknowledgement was the most significant external confirmation available of the documentation's central claim. It was the confirmation of the man the documentation described, produced through his own cooperation with a biographical project that required the acknowledgement of the private reality's distance from the official account in order to produce the specific narrative of the complex, misunderstood, romantically limited man that the authorized biography was designed to establish as the counter to Diana's account. The counter was not available in the form it was designed to be, because the counter required the acknowledgement that itself confirmed the central claim. The management apparatus had produced an authorized account that confirmed, in the specific form of Charles's own cooperation, the existence of the private reality whose documentation Diana had been producing. The Bashir moment was the documentation's culmination. The Dimbleby confirmation was the documentation's corroboration from the man the documentation described. Together they are the public record. The record contains both. The man they describe is King. Diana died on the 31st of August 1997 in a tunnel in Paris, and the record she had spent years producing became, in the specific moment of her death, something different from what it had been during her life. During her life, the documentation was evidence in an ongoing process, the product of a woman who was still inside the situation the documentation described, still managing the gap between the official account and the private reality, still making decisions about what to do with the evidence she had produced and how to deploy it in the service of the purpose she had designed it for. The documentation was active during Diana's life in the specific sense that it was still being shaped by the decisions of the person who had produced it, still under the direction of the woman whose strategic intelligence had produced the Morton sessions and the Bashir interview, and who was, at the time of her death, in the process of determining what the documentation's next phase would be. The death converted the active into the archive, not the passive archive of something that has ceased to be relevant. The Diana archive was never and has never been that kind of archive. The living archive of something whose production has ended, but whose significance has not. The specific form of documentation that becomes, at the death of its producer, simultaneously more available and less directable. More available because the produced death removes the specific management constraints that the producer's continued life within the institutional context had imposed on the documentation's full accessibility. Less directable because the producer, who had been managing the documentation's deployment towards specific purposes, was no longer available to manage it. The institution's response to the death and to the documentation's conversion into the living archive was the response of an institution that had been managing the documentation during Diana's life, and that was now required to manage it without the specific challenge that Diana's continuing presence had imposed. The challenge of the living source, whose ability to produce additional documentation, to extend the record, to respond to the management apparatus's counter-narratives with further direct evidence, had been the most significant constraint on the management apparatus's ability to fully contain the documentation's impact. The management of the living source had required the sustained engagement that the management apparatus had deployed. The counter-narratives, the discrediting strategies, the legal management of the documentation's specific forms, the institutional steps taken to reduce Diana's access to the resources and standing that the institution had previously provided. All of this had been organized around the specific challenge of a living source who was continuing to direct the documentation against the official account. The death removed the challenge. The documentation was now fixed in the form it had achieved. The Morton sessions, the Bashir interview, the specific public record that Diana had placed in the public sphere before her death. It could not be extended. It could not respond to the management apparatus's subsequent counter-narratives with additional direct evidence. It was the record as Diana had left it, and the management of that record was now the management apparatus's primary operation in relation to the documentation. The management of the fixed record was a different, and in some ways more manageable operation than the management of the living source. The fixed record's form was known. The management apparatus could assess exactly what the documentation contained and could deploy its tools against that specific content rather than against the potential additional content that the living source's continued presence had always threatened. The counter-narratives could be calibrated precisely to the documentation's fixed form rather than to the anticipation of additional evidence that the living source might produce. The calibration produced the specific form of the post-Diana management that this series has described across multiple preceding accounts. The rehabilitation, the management of the Camilla narrative, the specific deployment of the official account in the forms that the fixed record's specific content had been assessed as requiring. The rehabilitation required the management of Diana's fixed record as the primary challenge. The specific work of managing the public's reception of the documentation in ways that allowed the rehabilitation's objectives to be achieved despite the documentation's existence. The work was substantial and it was sustained, and it achieved what it was designed to achieve in the operational sense. The rehabilitation produced the coronation. The coronation placed Charles on the throne. The management of Diana's fixed record across the 26 years between her death and the coronation was sufficient for the institutional objective. What the management could not do was change what the record contained. The record contained what Diana had placed in it during her life, in the form she had chosen, through the strategic intelligence that had produced the documentation's specific design. The record's content was fixed at Diana's death, in a form that the subsequent management could interpret and manage around, but could not alter. The specific voice on the cassette tapes was Diana's voice, speaking in the specific terms of direct personal experience, with the specific quality that the unmediated form of the sessions had produced. The specific face on the Bashir interview footage was Diana's face, in the specific form of presence that the interview had captured and that the 23 million people who had watched it had received, and that the hundreds of millions who had subsequently watched it had received in the same form. The documentation was fixed in the form of the person who had produced it, and the fixity was the documentation's most significant feature as a record. It was the thing that made the management operations management of the record something other than the management of something the management had produced. The management had not produced the record, Diana had produced it. The management was managing something it had not produced and whose form it had not controlled, and that therefore retained, despite the management operations' sustained effort, the specific qualities that its producer had designed it to have. The quality of direct testimony, the quality of unmediated first-person experience, the quality of a woman who trusted her own perception of what she had experienced and who had spoken about it in the terms that the trust produced. These qualities survived the management operation. They survived the rehabilitation. They survived the coronation. They are in the record now, in the same form that Diana placed them there. The specific, direct, unmediated testimony of a woman who was inside the private reality and who documented it with the strategic intelligence of someone who understood that the documentation was the only evidence available to her, and that the evidence quality needed to be sufficient to withstand the management apparatus's most sustained and most sophisticated efforts to reduce it. The tape survived, the Bashir footage survived, the Morton book survived. The Friends account survived in the semi-public record, the staff account survived in the semi-public record, the social world's private knowledge survived in the semi-public record. The Dimbleby biography survived as the corroboration from the man the documentation described. All of it survived in the specific forms that the management apparatus could manage around but could not eliminate. The survival is the record's testament to the quality of Diana's documentation, the specific quality of the design that produced evidence robust enough to survive the management apparatus's most sustained efforts. The design was a woman's response to the specific challenge of documenting a private reality in conditions of institutional opposition, isolation, and surveillance, using the specific resources her situation made available toward the specific purpose of making the private reality accessible to the public in a form whose credibility was sufficient to achieve that purpose. The purpose was achieved during Diana's life, in the specific moment of the Bashir interview's reception by 23 million people. The achievement has survived Diana's death in the form of the record's continued presence in the public sphere and the continued public reception of the record as credible testimony. What did not survive, in the specific form that Diana's continued life would have sustained, was the ability to respond to the management apparatus's subsequent operations in real time. The rehabilitation's management of the fixed record was more effective than it would have been against a living source. because the living source would have been available to respond to the rehabilitation's specific moves with additional documentation, additional testimony, additional forms of the evidence that had already produced the public account the rehabilitation was working against. The rehabilitation operated against an archive rather than a living source. The archive could not respond. The management apparatus could deploy its tools against the archive's fixed content without the risk of the source's response that the living source had always represented. This asymmetry is the most significant feature of the post-Diana period for the assessment of the documentation's continued significance in the record. The record contains the documentation. The record also contains the evidence of the management apparatus's operation against the documentation, the rehabilitation, the coronation, the specific institutional steps taken to manage the fixed record's content into a form compatible with the institutional objectives the management was designed to achieve. Both are in the record. The documentation survived the management. The management produced the coronation. The record holds both. It does not choose between them. It contains them. The containing is the record's function. The function is being performed. The record is here. The coronation happened on the 6th of May 2023 in Abbey and was conducted with a 1,000-year wait ceremony that the institution has developed for the specific, sustained, deliberately overwhelming combination of music and pedantry and the physical weight of the sound that produces in the people watching it, the specific experience the institution designs the ceremony to produce. The experience is not primarily an intellectual one. It is the experience of continuity, the specific feeling that what is happening has happened before and will happen again, that the institution and its ceremony are larger than any individual, that the specific moment of the crown's placement on the specific head is simultaneously the present moment and the long record of all the previous moments of the same kind, and that the person receiving the crown is, in that moment, less an individual with a specific private history and a specific documented private character, and more the embodiment of the continuity itself. The ceremony is designed to produce this experience. It is among the institution's most effective management tools, not because it manages any specific piece of information, not because it makes any specific claim about the man receiving the crown that is available for assessment against the documentary record, but because it temporarily displaces the individual from the attention of the people watching and replaces the individual with the institution. While the crown is being placed, the man on the throne is the institution rather than the man. The institution's continuity is the foreground. The man's specific documented private history is the background. Charles has been king since the 8th of September 2022, when his mother died at Balmoral, and the constitutional succession produced the automatic consequence that his entire adult life had been organized around in one way or another. The coronation formalized what the succession had already established, gave it the specific ceremonial form that the institution requires the succession to take for the public acknowledgement of its completion to be as complete as the ceremony can make it. The man who received the crown on the 6th of May 2023 was the man Diana documented. This is not a complicated claim. It is the straightforward consequence of the obvious fact that people do not become different people when they receive institutional recognition of their institutional position. The private character that Diana documented across the years of their marriage, with the specific strategic intelligence and the specific care for the evidence's quality that the preceding parts of this account have described, was the private character of the man who is now king. The documentation does not expire. It does not become less relevant because the institutional context in which the documented man operates has changed. It does not become false because the institution has produced the ceremony that acknowledges the succession. The documentation is the record of who the man is in the private register. In the context where the public register is not required and where the private character expresses itself in the ways the documentation describes, the private register does not change because the institutional context has changed. The man who communicated in the dismissive, condescending, emotionally withholding terms that Diana documented in the household that the marriage produced is, the man who now communicates with the people in his closest proximity in the private register of the institutional household he now leads. The people in his closest proximity now are different from the people whose proximity produced the documentation. Camilla's primary relationship and the specific quality of that relationship's dynamics is not the dynamics that the documentation describes. The documentation describes the dynamics of the marriage to Diana, not the dynamics of the relationship with Camilla, and the two relationships are different in the ways that relationships between different people with different specific histories are always different. The rehabilitation has produced the specific narrative of Charles and Camilla's relationship as the resolution of the long history. And the resolution has its own specific character that the documentation of the Wales marriage does not determine. But the private register is the private register. The specific qualities that Diana documented, the dismissal, the condescension, the emotional withholding, the strategic deployment of psychological pressure in the closest relationships, are the qualities of a formation that the marriage to Diana did not produce. They were present before the marriage, as this account's preceding parts have established in their description of the formation, that the institutional upbringing and the specific inheritance of the heirs produced in the man Diana married. They were documented during the marriage. They are the qualities of the man rather than the qualities of the specific marriage that produce the documentation. The staff of the current King Charles's household are the people who inhabit the closest proximity to the private register now. Their experience of the private register, the specific experience that the people in the closest professional proximity to the documented man have now, is not available in any direct form from the public record, because the management apparatus continues to operate with the sustained effectiveness that this series has described in managing household staff's potential disclosures of private register observations into the silence of the institutional code and the NDA. But the pattern of institutional management that this series has described across multiple accounts of multiple royal households suggests the character of what the management apparatus is managing in the current king's household. The pattern is consistent across the accounts. The management is deployed against information that threatens the official account. The official account of the current king's household is the official account of a man whose public service and genuine commitment and the specific qualities the image apparatus has cultivated into the king's public profile are the defining features of his public identity. The management of the private register's potential disclosures continues in the form that the pattern describes, not as the acknowledgement of specific incidents or specific behaviors that require specific management, but as the routine operation of an apparatus that manages the household's private reality into the institutional silence that the official account requires. William is watching, not passively. William has inherited the institutional formation that shapes his relationship to the management operation, and he is now the heir in the position that his father occupied for 30 years before the accession. The formation that the inheritance produces, the specific relationship to the management operation and its requirements, the specific understanding of the gap between the official account and the private reality as a manageable gap, rather than a gap that requires honest acknowledgement, is the formation that William absorbed from the household whose private register Diana documented. And it is the formation that the institutional role now requires him to deploy in his own household. The pattern of the formation's transmission is the most significant feature of the current moment in the record's assessment of the institution's trajectory. The formation that produced the documented private character in the man who is now king was transmitted to the man's sons through the household's atmosphere. The formation's specific products, the management of the gap, the maintenance of the surface, the institutional requirement that the private register's qualities be managed into the silence that the official account requires, are the formation's ongoing transmission to the next generation of the institution's inheritors. Harry broke with the transmission. The break was the specific act of a man who had absorbed the formation's products through the developmental stage of his childhood and who had, through the specific experience of watching the management apparatus, is operate against his own wife in ways that reproduce the pattern Diana's documentation described. The specific understanding that the formation's transmission required his participation in the management operation that had cost Diana what it had cost. The break was costly. This series has noted the cost in preceding accounts. The cost is real and was incurred deliberately with the awareness of what the break would cost, because the break was the specific expression of someone who had decided that the transmission's continuation was not something they were willing to participate in. William did not break. The formation held in William in the form that the institutional role requires. The management of the gap, the maintenance of the surface, the specific relationship to the documentation that the institutional formation produces in the people it forms. The formation's continuation in William is the institution's most significant current management operation, the maintenance of the gap in the next generation of the inheritance, the production of the heir who will manage the documentation as the institution requires the documentation to be managed. The documentation is the record of what the institution is managing. The institution is managing the documentation with the same tools it has been managing it with since Diana's death. The counter-narratives, the managed courage, the institutional ceremonies that temporarily displace the individual from the foreground of the attention and replace them with the institution's continuity. The management produced the coronation. The coronation placed the documented man on the throne. The throne is occupied by the man the documentation describes. The documentation is in the record. The record does not change because the man has been crowned. It does not become less accurate because the institution has produced the ceremony. It does not become less relevant because 26 years have passed since Diana produced it. It is the record. The record holds the man. It holds the documentation. It holds the coronation alongside both. It does not choose between them. It contains them. This is what records do. This is what this record does. The documented man is king. The documentation remains. The record is here. Diana left several things in the record. She left the cassette tapes, the specific, unmediated, first-person voice of a woman speaking about her own experience in a private room in Kensington Palace, in the full presence of her own perception, with the specific care of someone who understood that what she was producing needed to be good enough to outlast the management operation mounted against it. She left the interview, 4 minutes and 17 seconds of the most significant public disclosure in the modern history of the British monarchy, delivered in her own face and her own voice to an audience that received it in the specific form she had spent years preparing them to receive it. She left the friends' accounts and the staff accounts, the social world's private knowledge, the external corroboration that the documentation's design had been building toward, assembled in the semi-public record in the partial and oblique forms that the management apparatus could contain but not eliminate. She left two sons who absorb the household's atmosphere in their respective developmental forms and who carry, in the different ways that different people carry the formative experiences of their earliest years, the specific knowledge that the household produced in the children who grew up inside it. These are the concrete things she left in the record. They are significant, and they are documented, and they are the foundation on which this account and the accounts that preceded it in this series are built. But Diana left something else in the record that is less concrete and more durable than any of these. Something that this account has been approaching throughout its preceding parts without fully naming, and that the epilogue requires to be named directly. She left the demonstration that it is possible to be inside one of the most powerful management operations in the modern world, to be inside it as the person whose silence the management most requires, whose continued performance of the official account the management depends on, whose private experience of the private reality is the information the management most needs to prevent from reaching the public, and to produce, from inside that position, the specific evidence of the private reality in a form robust enough to achieve its purpose. The demonstration is the record's most significant feature, not the specific content of the documentation, though the specific content is significant, and this account has engaged with it across its preceding parts. The demonstration itself, the specific act of a woman who was isolated and surveilled and institutionally opposed, and who found in the specific resources her situation made available, the way to produce the evidence that the management operation was specifically designed to prevent. The way required the specific intelligence that Diana brought to it, the understanding of the management apparatus, tools and vulnerabilities, the design of the documentation in the specific form whose robustness the management apparatus was least equipped to reduce, the building of the public standing that gave the documentation the credibility the management apparatus could not override. None of this was given to Diana. She built it inside the management operation, against the management operation's sustained resistance, using the resources the management had not accounted for. The resources were her own, the intelligence, the perception, the specific quality of the social and emotional attunement that her detractors had managed as evidence of inadequacy, and that was in fact the specific quality most dangerous to the management operation's success, because it was the quality that understood the management apparatus's operation from inside it and found the specific vulnerabilities the design required. The courage, which was not the absence of fear, but the specific decision to proceed despite the fear, in full awareness of what the proceeding would cost. The specific love for the people she was trying to reach. The 23 million people, the public that she had been receiving as real, and that had been receiving her as real, and to whom she understood she owed the truth of what she had experienced in the way that people who have been genuinely connected owe each other the truth. These were Diana's resources. They were the resources the management apparatus had not anticipated and could not adequately contain. The management apparatus has continued to operate across the 26 years since Diana used those resources to produce the documentation that this account has been building from. It has produced the rehabilitation and the coronation and the continued official account of the man Diana, documented as the sensitive, reformed, publicly committed future king who became the actual king. The operation has achieved its institutional objectives, but the documentation remains, in the specific, robust, deliberately designed form that Diana produced it in, with the specific qualities that the design was built to preserve against the management apparatus's most sustained efforts. The tapes, the interview footage, the specific public record of a woman who was inside the private reality and who made the private reality public in a form that the management could not fully contain. The record is more complete because Diana produced the documentation she produced. Not complete in the absolute sense. The full private reality of any marriage and any family is never fully accessible in any public record, and the specific dimensions of Charles's private character that Diana documented are not the only dimensions of a complex person's complex life. The record is more complete than the management apparatus intended it to be, and the incompleteness is the incomplete suppression of evidence that Diana produced specifically to resist suppression. King Charles is on the throne. The institution continues. The management apparatus continues. The official account continues in the mainstream record in the form the management has produced and sustained. The documentation continues alongside it, in the record where Diana placed it, where it will remain. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.